Chapter 485. And you, Shedong. Lin Yuan's gaze shifted again, his killing intent raging as he coldly said, "Tell those little bastards under you that after the main forces of the barbarians are defeated, it will be your turn to reap the fruits of the battle. If you can't wipe out those defeated and deserters, you'll have a taste of your own medicine. This king won't take your life or disband the association of the Demon Emperor, but don't even think about messing with Luo Shu in the future. Just be his lackey." "Yes, sir." Shedong shuddered, and his expression suddenly became serious. As an official in the prosperous northern frontier, even the most strong-willed person would inevitably make mistakes. Even if they didn't dare to touch the fat meat that belonged to His Excellency the Dragon King, it wouldn't be a problem for them to suck the oil off their hands. However, these were things that could be used against them, and they were in the hands of the embroidered uniform guards and the association of the Demon Emperor. Therefore, once Shedong and Luo Shu fell out, these northern frontier officials would have no choice but to take sides and express their support. When the time came, both sides would throw out the dirty information in their hands, and it was hard to say how many people in the northern frontier would lose their head. During this period of time, he had been fighting openly and covertly with Luo Shu. For example, in order to monopolize the credit for suppressing the aristocratic families, he couldn't even share the information in his hands with Luo Shu. This caused Luo Shu to resort to many dirty and underhanded methods, causing the reputation of the embroidered uniform guards to worsen. Although it was to his liking, this Dragon King was clearly unhappy. Li Zhong. After Shedong also bid farewell and left, Lin Yuan's gaze fell on Li Zhong. "Yes, sir." Li Zhong quickly lowered his head, not daring to look Lin Yuan in the eye. This was because he suddenly realized he had made a huge mistake. Although this mistake was something to be happy about for most rulers, it was clearly impossible for such a good opportunity to fall from the sky. However, because of the matter with the barbarians, he had neglected the great situation on the battlefield and ruined the arrangements Lin Yuan had painstakingly made. Whether there would be another such opportunity in the future was not even up to Lin Yuan and him to decide. This king scrammed to the side and faced the wall. "This king finds you an eyesore." As expected, after Li Zhong agreed, Lin Yuan's roar suddenly sounded. Li Zhong shrunk his neck and obediently walked to the wall. After the evil fire in his heart had mostly dissipated, Lin Yuan cast his gaze on Zhong Xiu's face that was covered in black scales. Zhong Xiu also stood up straight and looked at Lin Yuan with a face full of anticipation. After all, he was a newly surrendered general who had just joined Lin Yuan's side. He did not have any contributions to the northern frontier. Moreover, the small actions he had taken to protect the development of the northern frontier were firstly for his own selfish reasons, and secondly, it was not convenient to talk about them. Therefore, Zhong Xiu believed that as long as he became one of the meritorious officials of the northern frontier, he could at least guarantee his future position, even if these old subordinates did not reject him. "Go look for Gao Buzhen. He will arrange for you to go to the south." Lin Yuan's heterochromatic eyes overflowed with a cold light as he said in an incomparably ruthless manner, "Since that old thing Lei Qiusheng dared to do such a thing, then no wonder this king wants to do the same. I believe that with your understanding of the south, you can better arrange for those evil cultists and know where to use them to cause the greatest damage." "Evil?" "Yes." Zhong Xiu's expression changed slightly, and he almost cursed out loud, but he quickly adjusted his posture. What kind of monsters were these two people that he had been serving ever since he had hidden his identity? One did not hesitate to sacrifice his territory in the north and his own face to brazenly lead the barbarians of the Shuangjian dynasty to invade. The other made corresponding arrangements in the south, preparing to lead the evil cultists who had been expelled to the isolated islands overseas with great difficulty back to the mainland. After all, although the north was vast, it was mostly mountainous, and there were not many places suitable for horses to run and raise. Even if the barbarians took over the north, when they realized that this meat was of little value, they would naturally withdraw from the north. At that time, whether or not they could retreat unscathed would depend on the recovery of the Shunwu dynasty. But those evil cultists, they were like weeds. As the saying went, even if a wildfire could not burn them out, they would grow again when the wind blew. Once this group of evil cultists entered a densely populated area, they would be like fish in water. In less than half a month, they could turn a group of simple and honest people into murderers who would sacrifice themselves for those unknown evil gods. When that time came, the South would inevitably be even more chaotic than it was now. There might not even be a way to uproot these evil cultists even until death. After all, although the previous expulsion of the evil cultists seemed to have gone smoothly, the various forces had secretly prepared for hundreds of years in order to succeed. This was nothing more than inviting trouble to oneself. However, Zhongxiu did not know whether Lei Qiusheng had the ability to completely wipe out the cultists. At this time, it was not good to say much. He could only swallow this bitter fruit. After all, Lin Yuan was right. This was the result of Lei Qiusheng's actions. As long as the barbarians of the Shuangjian dynasty did not enter the territory of the north, the evil cultists of the south would not strike. Both sides had placed a time bomb beside each other, but no one knew when this time bomb would detonate. Therefore, they could only remain in a stalemate and wait for both sides to be ready to fight. Zhongxiu was very clear that no matter how well he did this task, he was destined to leave behind a bad name in the future. Obviously, this Blackwater Dragon King was not a magnanimous person. Previously, when the remnants of the Jiao clan pretended to be members of the Association of the Demon Emperor and wanted to conquer Shunning City for the demon beasts, it was to nail the Association of the Demon Emperor to the pillar of shame. Now that Lin Yuan asked him to be in charge of the evil cultists, it was tantamount to nailing him to the pillar of shame. In the future, no matter what attitude Zhongxiu had towards Lin Yuan would always be able to grab hold of his weakness. Once this scandal was exposed, not to mention restoring the Myriad Swords dynasty, even the remnants of the Jiao clan who had successfully restored their country would not be able to tolerate it. Although Zhongxiu had accepted the task, he was still standing in the same place. Lin Yuan moved his body, his head almost touching Zhongxiu's face, and said coldly, "Why? Are you not willing to do this task?" Lin Yuan's voice exploded in his ears like spring thunder. Only then did Zhongxiu wake up from his inner struggle. He could only clasp his fists at Lin Yuan awkwardly, and then quickly leave the meeting hall. So be it if you want to be a dog. In any case, he had already become like this, neither human nor ghost. Why would he care so much? If he did not complete Lin Yuan's task well, he naturally did not need to think about what would happen to him in the future, because he would not have a future. After everyone left, Li Zhong trembled and turned his head to look at Lin Yuan with an extremely ugly expression. Chapter 486. Do you think you are very humorous? Lin Yuan glanced at the trembling Li Zhong and narrowed his eyes. He said coldly, "This king created an opportunity for you, but you chose to stand on Shadong's side. Do you really want Zhongxiu to think that you old subordinates of the northern frontier are suppressing him? I really didn't realize it before, but after thinking it through, I still believe that I did the right thing." Li Zhong was stunned for a moment before he slowly said, "However, Zhongxiu is a very wild person. If we don't suppress him, he will definitely think that he can sit back and enjoy the northern frontier. However, if I cooperate with Shadong to expose this matter, Zhongxiu will definitely feel a sense of danger. As such, no matter what mission the Dragon King gives him, he can only do his best to complete it. Otherwise, according to his habitual thinking, he will probably think that we old people of the northern frontier will not give him a place to stay. However, if you use a gentler method, you can still achieve your goal. You can even make Zhongxiu feel grateful to you." Lin Yuan's eyes were still narrowed as he slowly said, "You must know that a starving camel is still bigger than a horse. The embroidered uniform guard is far more powerful than the association of the Demon Emperor and the embroidered uniform guard that we temporarily established. In a mere northern frontier, we naturally have the advantage. However, after leaving the northern frontier, they don't have much of a chance of winning against the embroidered uniform guard." Lin Yuan paused. Even if the embroidered uniform guard has changed masters, with Zhongxiu's personality, he will definitely have a backup plan. At the very least, the people he placed in the northern frontier before his identity was exposed are absolutely loyal to him. These people are the backup plan he left for himself. Even a cunning rabbit has 3 burrows, let alone a venomous snake like Zhong Xiu. No matter how Zhong Xiu performed in front of Lin Yuan, no one would lower their guard against him, even if he was just an embroidered pillow. After all, this guy had great willpower and ambition to change his appearance and hide by Lei Qiusheng's side. He was even able to contend with Lei Qiusheng for such a long time and obtain such great authority. This was enough to make many so-called ambitious people blush with shame. Even though Lin Yuan was used to being in a superior position, he still didn't have the confidence to control Zhong Xiu. Therefore, when he fed him the dragonization root, he also injected his own curse poison into Zhong Xiu's body to restrict him. If Zhong Xiu and his lackeys could become Li Zhong's support, they would be the third spy force between the Council of the Demon Emperor and the embroidered uniform guards. The triangle was the most stable. When the time came, the 3 sides would suppress and balance each other. Only then would Li Zhong, who was sitting on the throne of the northern frontier, be stable. He wouldn't be directly pushed down from the throne of the northern frontier by Shidong and Luo Shu's combined efforts. However, Li Zhong had missed the opportunity to be gentle with Zhong Xiu. He was even secretly standing on the opposite side of Zhong Xiu. This was the reason why Lin Yuan was so angry. Li Zhong shook his head disapprovingly and said with a smile, "Dragon King's foresight is something your student can't match. However, the Dragon King is too kind to the people around him. This is a great weakness. Dragon King wishes for me to be benevolent and virtuous, but have you considered your own situation? There are no 2 suns in the sky. Your student uses benevolence to win people's hearts. The Dragon King uses martial prowess to deter the world. It sounds like a good idea, but has the Dragon King considered how we should interact in the future? When your student's wings are fully grown, even if your student is willing to bow down to you, those people under your banner will not agree." Lin Yuan was silent. He didn't know how to refute Li Zhong. In this life, he was born as a demonic beast. To him, this was his greatest weakness. As long as the humans and demonic beasts in the Sky Martial continent didn't make peace and share the world, then Lin Yuan could only be the king behind the scenes. Lei Fan, Hu Yang, Li Zhong, they were all faces that Lin Yuan had nurtured in this sick environment. However, the greatest drawback of doing this was time. Even if he was a puppet, after being in this position for a long time, he would become the true king in the hearts of others. When his wings were fully grown, there would definitely be a battle between the 2 sides. It was just that the time of the battle would be sooner or later. Unless by that time, Lin Yuan had already unified the Sky Martial continent and solved the problem of the Heaven's Gate. Otherwise, it would always be a tragedy where those close to him would feel pain and those close to him would feel joy. Let's talk about Zhong Xiu again. Li Zhong's expression turned solemn and changed from his previous trembling appearance. He gritted his teeth and said, "He is a poisonous snake. In terms of conciliation, I don't think anyone has done a better job than Lei Qiusheng. He promoted him from a lowly position and treated him as a trusted aide. He gave him the control of the embroidered uniform guards and the Ether Society, which were in the shadows but could affect the entire empire. However, what was the result? Has Zhong Xiu ever been loyal to Lei Qiusheng?" Li Zhong gently shook his head and sneered, "The best way to deal with this kind of poisonous snake is to suppress it, push it aside, and let it live in eternal fear. Let it feel that it will lose everything if it makes a small mistake. This way, Zhong Xiu can be of help to us instead of nurturing a tiger that will only invite calamity." Lin Yuan was silent for a moment. Then, he slowly opened his eyes and said helplessly, "All right, you've convinced me. Go about your business." When he finished speaking, Lin Yuan's figure had already faded and disappeared from the meeting hall. It was only at this moment that a thin layer of cold sweat appeared on Li Zhong's forehead. The corners of his mouth trembled slightly and he squeezed out a bitter smile. When working by the side of the Dragon King, he had to always remember the saying, "Being by the side of the Emperor is like being by the side of a tiger." An opportunity or a problem could be a test given by the Dragon King. If he passed the test, everything would be fine. However, if he went against the intentions of the Dragon King, Lei Fan and Hu Yang were bloody precedent. Although Li Zhong did not know whether Zhong Xiu's matter was an opportunity or a test for him, his rationality reminded him that if he wanted to live a long life as the king of the northern frontier, he should never stand in the way of Lin Yuan. He should not have any thoughts that he should not have. As for the nonsense of replacing him, it was all because of his greed. Once he took that step, no matter how intelligent he was, he would not have a good ending. Therefore, from the initial mistake to the subsequent determination, Li Zhong had always maintained a certain attitude to reject Zhong Xiu's participation. Luo Shu and Shedong could become partners, but Zhong Xiu could not. This poisonous snake's ambition was too great. Even if he became a role like the king of the northern frontier and obtained enough authority, he would still not understand what it meant to be content. He would not accept the existence of a retired emperor above him. When the time was right, he would overestimate himself and challenge Lin Yuan's authority. Then, he would be smashed into pieces. Being associated with such a person, even if he did not participate in some matters, the best outcome would be to be implicated. Chapter 487. North of the Shunwu dynasty, Donglin City. Li Zhongxing was dressed in golden armor and had a scarlet cloak draped over his back. He stepped on the city wall with one foot and looked at the frost mirror cavalry that roared past like tigers and wolves. Cold sweat slowly seeped out of his forehead. These Shuangjian barbarian soldiers had changed their previous style of destroying everything they passed by and marched uniformly toward the northern frontier. It was as if Donglin City and other cities that still belonged to the Shunwu dynasty did not exist. They did not even pretend to attack. They even took a detour around the almost defenseless farms and villages outside the city. Seeing this scene, Li Zhongxing's hope for that man was once again shattered. The Shuangjian barbarian soldiers' style of action was obviously because they had reached an agreement with some people from the Shunwu dynasty. Their only goal this time was the northern frontier. Although that person was trying his best to protect the cities and people in the north, he did not seem to know that the Shuangjian barbarian soldiers loved to repeat their actions and did not hesitate to push the entire north into a pit of fire. After struggling for a while, he finally sighed faintly and said in a clear voice, "The craftsmen and materials prepared by your highness have already entered Donglin City, right?" "Yes. Although we're not sure when the barbarians will come, it's better to be prepared than to be suddenly attacked." When the higher-ups made the decision, they had already put it into action. 60% of the craftsmen and all the materials have now been transported to Donglin City and the nearby cities. Although the number of craftsmen did not meet the requirements, we can still complete the project on time by putting some of our soldiers into the construction of the Great Wall project. Standing next to Li Zhongxing was a middle-aged warlord who was as burly as a bear. He was also dressed in golden armor, but there was more worry in his eyes than Li Zhongxing's. Obviously, he had not been baptized by the flames of war and was very nervous in the face of such a battle. Pa. Li Zhongxing gently patted the general's shoulder and said with a chuckle, "There's nothing to be nervous about. Don't be fooled by how arrogant these barbarians are now. Once our plan is carried out step by step, they'll have to leave all their men and horses behind in the north. Are you afraid of a group of people who are about to die?" He remembered the middle-aged general's name, Qiao Yu. Although his surname was Qiao, he had nothing to do with the Qiao family of the northern frontier. He was a true civilian of the northern frontier, and his ancestors had all been honest farmers for 10 generations. Although he was fortunate enough to be selected as one of the first students of the Northern Frontier Academy, Li Zhongxing had been a lecturer at the Northern Frontier Academy for 2 days, so he had a deep impression of this ridiculously sturdy fellow. However, they encountered such a large-scale war before they even graduated. It even involved 2 dynasties. Nobody knew if it was a blessing or a curse for the first batch of students. Just then, a white carrier pigeon descended from the sky and landed accurately on Li Zhongxing's shoulder. Li Zhongxing first took off a small cloth bag from his waist and fed the carrier pigeon a piece of jerky. Then, he reached out to take off the small wooden bucket tied to the carrier pigeon's leg, removed the cork, and poured out the letter inside. After glancing at the numbers on the letter, his face turned gloomier. According to the information sent back by the members of the Association of the Demon Emperor from the front lines, there were as many as 500,000 barbarians invading the north this time. It was said that Shuang Jianhan's 13th son had entered the northern frontier some time ago and lost contact with the Shuangjin dynasty's army. Therefore, Shuang Jianhan had even sent out 3 Blood Liao knights to join this expedition, saying that they would find his son even if they had to dig 3 feet into the ground. In addition to the barbarians who had entered the northern territory, there were also 700,000 barbarian soldiers who had crossed the Wei River from the source where the river flowed gently. They were now heading straight for the central plains of the Shunwu dynasty. Although these barbarians had verbally reached an agreement with the Shunwu dynasty, they obviously had no intention of letting go of the rich south after entering the pass. Li Zhongsheng pondered for a moment before taking a pen and paper from a guard and writing, "The barbarians' movements are of utmost importance. You must send someone to follow the barbarian cavalry and report the situation every 30 minutes. If there is no response after 30 minutes, you will consider them as having died in battle. Send someone else to follow the barbarian cavalry." Of course, Li Zhongsheng also used code words. Although the birds that sent the letter were all demonic beasts, there was no lack of people with high cultivation among the barbarians. Moreover, one had to be skilled in archery and riding to make a living on the grassland. These birds were very easy to kill by the barbarians. Using code words to communicate was also to prevent the information from leaking out. He threw the order back into the small wooden bucket and tied it to the carrier pigeon's leg. With a light shake of his shoulder, the carrier pigeon suddenly flew into the sky. Li Zhongxing measured the situation on the city wall for a moment, then pointed to the west and said in a deep voice, "Although these barbarians won't act until they see the hare, it'll be difficult for them to continue chasing if they don't get any benefits. We have to stimulate their courage." As soon as he finished speaking, Qiao Yu, who was beside him, took a deep breath and growled, "Marshal Li, the troops in Donglin City are ready. As soon as you give the order, we'll take a shortcut and run in front of the barbarians. We'll King ambush them first." Smack. Li Zhongxing patted Qiao Yu's head again and said angrily, "Big Black Bear, when will you grow some brains? What are our identities now? We're the generals guarding the city of the Shunwu dynasty. If we run to the front and ambush these barbarians, won't we ruin the Dragon King's plans if they come around and stop chasing us?" Then, Qiao Yu's face froze, and he asked carefully. Li Zhongxing shook the scarlet cape behind him and sneered, "We'll go out and scout. We'll wipe out small groups of barbarians when we encounter them. After making sure that there are no barbarian cavalry nearby, we'll let the craftsmen and brothers come out to work. A bunch of ignorant fools. Do you think you can escape unscathed after entering my territory?" Li Zhongxing had seen the horror of cement with his own eyes. A bag of powder-like substance was turned into moldable paste with water. After being molded and air-dried for about 10 minutes, it immediately became a hard stone that was invulnerable to weapons, water, and fire. With the craftsmanship of the current northern frontier, even an all-out attack from an airborne realm cultivator with infinite strength would only leave a shallow mark on the cement wall. With this divine item in hand, Li Zhongxing was confident that he could build a high wall that would make the barbarians despair at first sight within 5 days as long as no one interfered. Qiao Yu scratched his head in confusion and said, "But isn't this our job to begin with? Marshal Li, you said that we need to stimulate the courage of these barbarians. Do you think we'll just let them ride on their horses like this?" Chapter 488. That's not our job. Li Zhongxing's eagle-like eyes narrowed slightly as he sneered. "Don't forget that we're the Southern Expedition Army. At most, we're only responsible for annihilating the defeated barbarians. If we stand out too much, what will our brothers do? Freeloaders." Qiao Yu's brain, which had grown muscles, turned quickly for a while before he exclaimed, "Commander Li, are you saying, other than them, who else is qualified to fight against the barbarian cavalry in the wild?" Li Zhongxing laughed self-mockingly and said sourly, "Other than the 5,000 Fallen Star Army, the Southern Expedition and the Northern Battlefront Army might be famous, but if we were to fight against the barbarian cavalry in the wild, we would only have a slim chance of survival. The Northern Frontier used to be so proud and arrogant. They didn't even bother to build the perfect fortifications in the 7 border cities that the Shunwu dynasty had built for many years. Instead, they directly tore down the city walls and divided the settlements. First of all, the demon beasts in the Hungduan Mountains could come out at any time and wipe out all the armed forces that didn't obey Lin Yuan. Second of all, it was because Lin Yuan had never taken the heavy infantry army of the Shunwu dynasty seriously. Although the heavy infantry army of the Shunwu dynasty was no weaker than the Frost Mirror cavalry, they were much more mobile. Once the two sides clashed, the Frost Mirror cavalry might not even be able to shake the formation of the Shunwu dynasty's heavy infantry army, but the Shunwu dynasty's heavy infantry army could quickly bypass the Shunwu dynasty's heavy infantry army and attack other troops. Even if they couldn't find the weakness of the Shunwu dynasty's heavy infantry army, they could easily leave the Shunwu dynasty's heavy infantry army behind and attack other cities. It was not that the northern frontier was afraid of the Frost Mirror cavalry in a head-on battle. It was just that the territory of the northern frontier was too vast. If they didn't fortify the city walls, they couldn't defend against the Frost Mirror cavalry's attacks. Therefore, they had to use Donglin City as the center and connect the nearby cities to form a strong pass without any natural barriers. This was the biggest investment in history. Everyone knew that the northern frontier was very cold, but few people knew that the amount of resources the Shunwu dynasty invested in the defense of the 7 border cities every year was enough to stun the aristocratic families in the south who fought each other for a sea trade route. In other words, if Lei Qiusheng hadn't combined the memories of his previous life to come up with a substitute for cement in this life, even if Lin Yuan owned a gold-swallowing beast called the Chamber of Commerce of the northern region, he wouldn't have been able to afford such a terrifying expense. Otherwise, Lei Qiusheng wouldn't have used the barbarians of the Mirror Frost dynasty as a killing move against Lin Yuan's weak spot. It was just that this stab was too fast and too sudden. If it weren't for the fact that the northern region was now full of heroes and had realized this early on, the Mirror Frost dynasty and the Shunwu dynasty might have succeeded. On the other side, Xiao Yan, who was wearing a brown warrior's robe, was squatting on the trunk of a giant tree. He narrowed his eyes and put an arrow made of crimson steel mastiff's bones on the bowstring. He slowly pulled the bowstring and adjusted his breathing. His voice echoed in the forest like the wind. Ready. Fire. Whoosh. 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 Thousands of sharp arrows suddenly flew out from the dense forest, like a black cloud surging out. Before the cavalry of Frost Mirror who were approaching from afar could react, the group of people at the front had been shot into sieves and fell into pools of blood. Don't panic. Don't panic. A general of Frost Mirror pulled on the reins and glanced at the casualties. He said fiercely, "There aren't many of them, only about 2,000 or 3,000. Rush over and eat them. Tell these bastards what's the matter, warriors of the grasslands. All Chiliarchs, move forward in a roundabout way. Archers, take out your bows and suppress the enemy." This general was obviously a veteran of the battlefield. With just a cursory glance at the casualties, he was able to deduce the number of archers who had suddenly launched an attack on them. However, before the experienced general could finish his sentence, another black cloud surged out of the forest and shot down another 300 Frost Mirror cavalrymen. There were even a few unlucky Blood Liao cavalrymen among them. Many of them were terrified by this sudden turn of events. The tribe that Frost Mirror Khan belonged to was the Shueliao tribe. Therefore, this extravagant cavalry was like the personal guards of the Frost Mirror royal family. Whether it was food, clothing, or armor, they were far superior to the other troops of the Shuangjian dynasty. If it were them, their bows and arrows might not be able to penetrate the armor of the Shueliao knights. Unless they were lucky enough to hit an exposed part of the armor, such as the face, the number of arrows would not be enough to cause any effective damage. But look at the arrows that were shot out. The arrows would instantly pierce through the leather armor of ordinary cavalry. The arrows would also instantly pierce through the secret metal armor of the Shueliao knights. The armor of their warriors was like a piece of paper, without any defensive ability at all. It was as if they were wrapped in a layer of paper. The general gritted his teeth and roared, "Brothers, if you're scared now and turn around to run, you'll still be shot for nothing. Who knows who will be the next unlucky ones to die? Draw your bows and return fire." We have 70 to 80,000 people on this road. Do you think we'll be scared away by a few thousand soldiers? Cover fire. Let the brothers of the assault cavalry charge in and kill these bastard. As soon as the general finished speaking, the Frost Mirror cavalrymen were somewhat reluctant, but they still quickly drew their bows and arrows. Feeling the wind around them, they aimed at the dense forest in front of them. Every one of them looked particularly ferocious as they gritted their teeth. After all, living on the cruel grassland, even a gust of cold wind could freeze people to death. If one's clothes were not tightly wrapped enough, it was not uncommon for parts of one's body to freeze off. Therefore, the Frost Mirror tribe rarely migrated after occupying suitable grassland. Even if a strong enemy came knocking on their door, they would choose to fight to the death. Otherwise, the number of people who died of diseases and cold in Lusang would be more than those who died in battle. To the Frost Mirror tribe, reputation was like an umbrella. If a powerful warrior appeared in a tribe, even a tribe more powerful than them would have to be polite to him. They had just entered the Shunwu dynasty's territory. If they were scared away by a few thousand soldiers in an ambush, they would never have a good life in the future. However, before they could release their arrows, another round of arrows shot out. This time, the Frost Mirror cavalrymen were prepared. They pulled on their reins and began to dodge the arrows. However, even if there was a gap in the formation of tens of thousands of people, there was only so much space. In the blink of an eye, many cavalrymen crashed into each other and were thrown off their horses. The number of Frost Mirror cavalrymen who died from being trampled by their horses was even more than the number of people killed by the third round of arrows. At this point, no matter how scared the Frost Mirror riders were, they had no choice but to be ruthless. After all, the enemy was still firing arrows at them. If they continued to waste time here, they would just be wasting their lives. They might as well take out the enemy in one go. Chapter 489. It's about time. Retreat. Sean tilted his head to the side and nimbly leaped onto another tree trunk. The rest of the tree elves also followed suit and began to retreat. After all, they could see that the barbarians had been instigated to the point that they were filled with anger. If they continued to stay here, they would only end up being annihilated by the barbarians' arrows and cavalry charges. After going deep into the forest for a while, the tree elves mounted the 9-colored deer that had been waiting for them and galloped into the depths of the forest with great familiarity. On the other side, the Frost Mirror cavalry finally reorganized their formation. They drew their bowstrings and fired their first volley of arrows at their targets in the distance. However, most of their arrows were scattered on the ground. Let alone their targets, they didn't even make it into the forest in front of them. A group of mounted archers who were good at controlling their lines immediately flushed red. They looked at their companions, not knowing what to do. It wasn't that they weren't good at shooting. It was just that their equipment wasn't on the same level at all. The compound bows in the tree elves' hands were new equipment developed by Lin Yuan's subordinates. Whether it was the range or the speed of their arrows, they were more than 10 times faster than the previous crossbows. Each compound bow could be sold for at least 10,000 gold on the black market. The Frost Mirror cavalry shot back according to their experience. Naturally, they wouldn't be able to reach the enemy's firing positions. Fortunately, they were all professional soldiers. It didn't take long for the entire formation to move quickly and approach the forest. However, when the Frost Mirror cavalry charged into the forest, they realized that the bastards who ambushed them had long fled. The arrows they shot into the forest to protect the cavalry unit were everywhere. However, not a single drop of blood could be seen. It was obvious that the enemy had retreated before they could launch an effective counterattack. The leader of the Frost Mirror cavalry had a gloomy expression. He said fiercely, "Brothers, do you see that? There are only a few thousand of you, and you're already making us cower like quails. If you continue with this attitude, none of us will end well. Now, everyone, listen up. Full speed ahead. Catch up to those bastards who dared to go against us and wash away our shame with their blood. Wash away our shame, kill." The surrounding Frost Mirror cavalrymen also roared in unison. They knew that they had come to the northern frontier mainly to find the 13th prince and loot some good stuff from the northern frontier. Shuang Jianhan had no intention of offending the northern frontier at all. Therefore, since they had divided their forces, they had to ensure that their mission was completed properly. Otherwise, everyone would be implicated when they returned, and no one would end up well. If these people who challenged the dignity of the Shuangjian dynasty didn't die, they would be nailed to the pillar of shame. After all, a war couldn't be easily started. Even if they wanted to prove their bravery on the battlefield, they might not have the chance. After the Frost Mirror cavalrymen dispersed, the trunk of a giant tree shook a few times. A chameleon-like demonic beast slowly revealed itself. It looked at the scattered cavalrymen and sneered, "Lord Dragon King is right. These Shuangjian barbarian are stupid. How dare they fight in the mountains of the northern frontier?" The chameleon stretched its body, which was almost stiff because it had to blend in with the surrounding environment. Then, it quickly climbed down the giant tree and walked towards Donglin City. Even the old hunters in the northern frontier didn't dare to enter the mountains of the northern frontier. After all, it was close to the Hengduan Mountains. No one knew whether the beasts in the mountains were wild beasts or demonic beasts. Moreover, Lin Yuan wanted to give the Frost Mirror cavalryman a big gift. He didn't have any scruples at all. He directly ordered the beast kings in the periphery of the Hengduan Mountains to send a large number of demonic beasts into the battle. Even in the forest near Donglin City, which was far from the Hengduan Mountains, there were no less than 10,000 demonic beasts hibernating. It was one thing for demonic beasts to come out of the mountains to attack humans, but it was another thing for humans to encounter demonic beasts in the mountains. Moreover, the northern frontier was extremely sensitive right now. The Shunwu dynasty couldn't control this place at all. Lin Yuan was also in cahoots with the demonic beasts. If the Frost Mirror cavalrymen encountered demi-humans or demonic beasts, even if they died, they would die in vain. No one would stand up for them. They wouldn't even get an explanation. Who asked you bunch of reckless barbarians to chase into the territory of the demonic beasts? In the northern frontier prince's mansion, Li Zhong, who was dealing with the reports that had been sent to him, suddenly had his eyes light up. He picked up the report from Donglin City. 1.2 million Frost Mirror cavalrymen had entered the hinterland of the Shunwu dynasty. Almost 1/10 of the Shuangjian dynasty's army had been mobilized. More importantly, 700,000 Frost Mirror cavalrymen had crossed the Wei River and headed for the central plains of the Shunwu dynasty. This was the best news he had received today. After all, the Shunwu dynasty's army and the Shuangjian dynasty's army had reached a tacit agreement to let them pass. If the barbarians had charged into the northern frontier, no one would have said anything. But now, even more barbarians had displayed their usual attitude and attacked the central plains of the Shunwu dynasty on a large scale. Based on the supervision of the Shunwu dynasty in the northern frontier, it would be difficult for the central plains to mobilize enough troops to deal with the 700,000 Frost Mirror cavalrymen in a short time, even though Shenlin Jun was on his way north. Unless Lei Qiusheng had withdrawn his army from the northern frontier. He had even given up on the source of the Wei River and defended the central plains to the death. Haha, you've been hunting geese all day. You've finally let the geese peck your eyes. Li Zhong stood up and knocked on the table twice. A moment later, a member of the Association of the Demon Emperor wearing a black robe and a qianhu of the embroidered uniform guards wearing a white Kirin suit walked into the office at the same time. The two of them looked at each other and snorted in unison, revealing looks of disdain. Yu Tong, mobilize the forces of the Association of the Demon Emperor in the Central Plains. You must spread the news that the Shuangjian barbarian has been released by the Shunwu dynasty's border army to all the cities in the Central Plains before the 700,000 Frost Mirror cavalrymen start their slaughter. When the time comes, public opinion will explode. If the Shunwu dynasty's border army doesn't do anything, these soldiers guarding the border can only atone for their crimes with their lives. With a glint in his eyes, Li Zhong took off a jade pendant from his waist and handed it to Yu Tong as he calmly instructed. Once the news that the Frost Mirror cavalrymen had been released by the border army spread, coupled with the 700,000 Frost Mirror cavalrymen invading the Central Plains, no matter how thick-skinned Lei Qiusheng was, he couldn't ignore the curses of his people. When the time came, the Shunwu dynasty's border army would have to be mobilized. Otherwise, the millions of border soldiers would have to choose social death. Of course, Lei Qiusheng didn't have to send troops to attack the Shuangjian dynasty. As long as he could seal his pockets and stop the Shuangjian dynasty's cavalrymen from entering the northern frontier, he would be grateful. Chapter 490. Yes, sir. Yu Tong excitedly took the jade pendant from Li Zhong's hand and winked at the genie guard as if he was showing off. Yu Dingchen, your mission is more important than Yu Tong's. Li Zhong picked up a letter with wet ink and handed it to the genie guard. He said in a deep voice, "You must pass through the Shuangjian barbarians' blockade before sunset today and hand this letter to Li Zhongxing in Donglin City. Have someone keep an eye on the Shunwu dynasty's border army. Once they give up their original defense line and retreat to the Central Plains, you guys can take advantage of the situation and kill them. While you're at it, you can occupy the source of the Wei River and set up an outpost there. Remember, you must take that place and never lose it." "Yes, sir." Yu Dingchen's face turned red as he shouted with all his strength. Obviously, he wanted to compete with Yu Tong. "Okay, go. There's no time to lose. You must complete my mission before sunset today. Otherwise, you will be killed without mercy." Li Zhong nodded with satisfaction and waved his hand to signal the two to leave. Once the Demon Emperor's meeting caused public opinion to explode in the Central Plains and the south, everyone in the Shunwu dynasty would be in danger. The border army would definitely take action. The border army near the north would definitely suffer. As for the border army near the Central Plains, they would have to withdraw their men to defend the Central Plains at least until Shunlin Jun entered the Central Plains to fight the Frost Mirror Cavalry. At that time, the border would definitely be short of manpower. Other than the necessary checkpoints, there would be no other defenses. Taking the source of the Wei River where the water flow was the smoothest was the same as eliminating the possibility of the Shunwu dynasty's army entering the Central Plains. It would be a joke if those iron cans of the Shunwu heavy infantry wanted to swim across the river. If they went down the Wei River, they would probably sink to the bottom and feed the fish. Unless the Shunwu dynasty could transfer a large number of ships from the south for the army to cross the river, they could only choose to fight Lin Yuan's army upstream with all their forces. Once the war reached that stage, Li Zhong could at least guarantee that the northern frontier would be invincible. After all, the Great Wall project that the Northern Territory was currently carrying out had truly cut off the possibility of the Mirror Frost Cavalry entering the Central Plains. Even the passes and guard stations that originally belonged to the Shunwu dynasty were blocked outside. Therefore, if the Mirror Frost Cavalry wanted to intervene in this war, they could only attack the Shunwu dynasty's main camp from the other side. No matter which side they wanted to help, with Lei Qiusheng's suspicious personality, he would not allow these barbarians to get close to his headquarters. It was only a matter of time before the two sides clashed, let alone now that 700,000 barbarians had invaded the Central Plains. As for the other possibility, Li Zhong could only chuckle. There were indeed many ships in the south, but they were mostly seagoing ships. They might not be able to operate well in the Wei River. Moreover, those ships belonged to the aristocratic families. If Lei Qiusheng wanted to conscript them to fight, it would mean that the aristocratic families in the south who relied on the sea to make a living. Not to mention that the south was now a powder keg that could explode at any time. Even if the northern frontier didn't have any troops in the south, the aristocratic families in the south would still try to wrestle with Lei Qiusheng. He didn't believe that Lei Qiusheng would be so bold as to allow the main forces of the Qingjiang dynasty and the Frost Mirror dynasty to enter the Central Plains together. Even if he was willing, the Frost Mirror dynasty and the Qingjiang dynasty wouldn't be willing. Which of them didn't have a top force backing them? It was true that Lin Yuan wanted to occupy the north and plot against the Shunwu dynasty. If they sent troops to hinder Lin Yuan, they would give Lin Yuan an excuse to attack them. Secondly, if Lin Yuan cut off the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce's support for a period of time, their national strength would quickly fall to the bottom. They would become trash that any of the 7 dynasties could step on. After Yu Tong and Yu Dingchen left, Li Zhong strode into the courtyard. He put his right hand to his mouth and whistled. In an instant, a green rock landed directly, and the force of its flapping wings easily raised the dust and fallen leaves in the courtyard. When the cyan rock finally heard him, Li Zhong said slowly, "Tell all the demi-human tribes to quickly enter the North Mountain Forest and wipe out the Frost Mirror Cavalry in batches. 5 days. We need to delay them for at least 5 days. When the time comes, whether we continue to fight or retreat, it will be up to the tribal chiefs to decide. As for the Hengduan mountain range, we don't need you to send troops to help us directly. However, it shouldn't be a problem for you to send 2 more waves of beasts to the Shuangjian dynasty's territory, right?" The cyan rock was obviously very cold. It was a mountain lord-level demonic beast, but it didn't seem to want to communicate with Li Zhong. It just nodded slightly. However, Li Zhong put his hands behind his back and said expressionlessly, "I have one more thing to say. Remember to pass it on. Both the Frost Mirror Dynasty and Xunwu Dynasty don't see demi-humans and demonic beasts as equal intelligent creatures. You can only live a good life under the rule of the Dragon King. If the North and the Northern Frontier have a new ruler, you will return to your previous life of eating raw meat and drinking blood. Because we are the only ones who see you as our own kind. The other humans will only see you as slaves and animals." The Blackwater Army had gone to the south. The Fallen Star Army was too small, and the Northern Army had to guard the northern frontier. The Southern expedition seemed to be powerful, but it was actually very scattered. Based on the current situation, none of the troops in the northern frontier were powerful enough. In this war, Lin Yuan could only rely on the demonic beasts and the demonic beasts. However, the demonic beasts didn't completely obey Lin Yuan's orders. They were only temporarily sent by the demonic beast king to support Lin Yuan. They could help Lin Yuan in the war, but they would never risk their lives for him. Most of the demonic beasts weren't as smart as humans. They thought that even if Lin Yuan lost the war and lost their territory, they would just retreat back to the Hengduan mountain range and continue their lives. They didn't consider the expansion of the Hengduan mountain range and the existence of the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce, which would be a great help to the overall strength of the Hengduan mountain range. Therefore, Li Zhong's words were not only to bring this demonic beast to the demonic beasts, but also to the demonic beasts. Although the demonic beasts could risk their lives for the demonic beasts, the Xunwu dynasty had enslaved them for many years. They would risk their lives for their own survival, but they wouldn't risk their lives for Lin Yuan's rule. Therefore, most of the demonic beasts were still in the northern frontier. Lin Yuan was worried that these demonic beasts would be blinded by the Xunwu dynasty's words. They thought that even if the northern frontier had a new ruler, they could still live a comfortable life under Lin Yuan's rule. Therefore, only a few loyal demonic beasts, such as Xiao Yan, participated in the war. Only by uncovering the bloody scars of their past could these demonic beasts realize that everything they had now was a gift from Lin Yuan. Chapter 491. Got it. Only then did Qing Peng nod his head with a solemn expression, and he replied. After Qing Peng flapped its wings and flew away, Li Zhong let out a sigh of relief. A hint of worry flashed across his face. Although he had made a lot of arrangements, he could only turn the situation in the most advantageous direction for the northern frontier if every chess piece was placed in the right position. Once one of the conditions was not met, the northern frontier would have a hard time moving forward. After all, it was not crazy to fight against a dynasty with a small territory. It was completely foolish. If Lin Yuan had not run the northern region into a one-man rule, held the lifeline of the 7 dynasties, and happened to be in troubled times, the current northern region would not even have the qualifications to fall out with Lei Qiushan. Faction War Model Name, Northern Defense War, Ongoing, Attacking Side, Frost Mirror, Xunwu, Powerful, Defending Side, Blackwater Dragon Palace, Normal, Evaluation. The host's chances of winning are not high. Please balance the combat power of both sides as soon as possible. Otherwise, there will be a danger of destruction. If the host wins this war, the host will receive 100,000 war point. If the host loses this war, the host will have to pay a few 100,000 war point. War mission, not released. Looking at the faction war model that suddenly popped up in front of him, Lin Yuan's mouth twitched slightly. The current Shenwu dynasty, which was extremely weak, and the Shuangjin dynasty, which was not using its full strength, was still above the northern frontier. This was not out of Lin Yuan's expectations. After all, a starving camel was still bigger than a horse. If Lei Qiusheng really did not see any hope of winning, he would have dragged Lin Yuan down with him a long time ago. What made Lin Yuan gasp was that the rewards and punishments for this war far exceeded the sum of all his previous wars. Once this battle was lost, Lin Yuan would not be able to afford such a huge loss. It would be good enough if he was reduced to an ordinary black serpent by strenuous cultivation. He was afraid that he would be directly squeezed dry, and then the system would directly remove the binding with him. The most terrifying thing was that this was only the prelude to the war. The final battle between him and the Shenwu dynasty had not even begun. The generals and armies of both sides had not even clashed once. They had only been scheming against each other, and the situation had already become unsalvageable. Actually, if it were anyone else, both sides would just suffer some losses and forget about this matter. However, Lin Yuan and Lei Qiusheng were the kind of people who would rather die than lose face. Originally, it was just a few secret clashes between the two of them that caused the two of them to become really angry. It evolved into a war that even the Shuangjin dynasty was involved in today. Lin Yuan pursed his lips, but the movement of his feet had obviously sped up. The first step to balance the fighting power of both sides was to pull out the nail of the enemy in the north. With Lin Yuan's current cultivation, he had set out from the northern frontier early and arrived at Wei River City before sunset. 5,000 soldiers of the Fallen Star Army and Gao Buzhen had set up a camp 10 miles away from Wei River City. There were also 30,000 new soldiers who had been transferred from the Northern Battlefront Army to the Fallen Star Army. They all looked energetic. There were at least 2,000 or 3,000 corpses piled up outside Wei River City. Judging from the style of their armors, they obviously belonged to Shunlin Jun. However, there was no engraving of Shunlin on their left armors, which meant that these people were the reserves of Shunlin Jun. They were far from the main force of Shunlin Jun. Lin Yuan stood in the air outside the camp. In less than 3 breaths, Gao Buzhen, who was wearing a silver armor, strode over with a faint smile on his face. Fallen Star Army, Gao Buzhen. Greetings, Lord Dragon King. I can't salute you fully because of my armor. Please forgive me, Lord Dragon King. Lin Yuan nodded slightly to Gao Buzhen, and asked directly, what's the matter with those corpses outside the city? After the barbarian cavalry entered the city, I had Marshal Li lead the main force to Eastwood City. When these little bastards saw that the main force stationed outside the city had left, they felt that their chance to stir up trouble had come. They first sent more than 10,000 men out of the city to test our strength. In the end, we drove them back the moment they saw us. Gao Buzhen didn't care about it at all. It was as if he didn't defeat the famous reserves of Shunlin Jun, but a bunch of chickens and pottery dogs. Well, it seems that you have fought with them. How do you feel? Lin Yuan glanced around the camp and found that almost everyone, including Gao Buzhen, was injured, but there was no fatal wound. As long as the wound was healed, as long as they didn't move too much, even their movement would not be affected. More importantly, although the number of these 35,000 people was better than the 10,000 Shunlin Jun who came out to explore, 30,000 of them were just recruits who had received military training for a period of time. It would be good if they didn't cause trouble on the fierce battlefield. They couldn't help much at all. But the opponent was the famous Shunlin Jun, who was known as the First Army of Shenwu. Even if he was just a reserve, he was selected from countless professional soldiers. His fighting power was not small. In such a situation, there was only one way to defeat the opponent with 0 casualties. That was to kill the general and capture the flag. It seemed that the former champion of the Fallen Star Army was still as brave as before. At most, it took him only 3 moves to kill the main general of Shunlin Jun's side. This made the remaining Shunlin Jun lose the will to fight, leading to a one-sided massacre. Speaking of this issue, Gao Buzhen showed a serious look and said in a deep voice, Feeling weak. This group of rice worms has the title of the first army of Shunwu, but it is far worse than the army of our generation. Not to mention my fallen star army, even those who just got the title of the first army could easily defeat them. After all, the 7 dynasties had been peaceful for a long time. The most chaotic period should be the period when Lei Chousheng usurped the throne. The army under his command fought day and night with the army loyal to the Shunwu dynasty. Even the army of the first army was quite strong. But after decades, those brave and invincible officers in the past were full of fat, and those loyal soldiers under their command had no hope of promotion. Naturally, they left the army early to find another way out. Compared with these old soldiers who had been peaceful for a long time, the fallen star army was indeed a bit of a bully. Of course, not all of them were old soldiers. It was just that the soldiers who fought in the situation where the whole country was a battlefield and were surrounded by enemies looked down on these Shuangjian barbarian soldiers who at most fought with the beast tide and pretended to rob the border every year. Except for the border troops who were fighting in the north and the west, there were not many troops who dared to say that they could withstand the attack of the fallen star army. Chapter 492. Is it possible to charge down Wei River City in one round? Lin Yuan raised his eyelids and asked. Jiao Chuanzhen was silent for a moment before honestly shaking his head. He said bitterly, Dragon King Daran, these little bastards don't deserve their reputation, but Wei River City is a fortress run by the Shunwu dynasty for many years. The city walls are hard and smooth. We can't get up without suitable siege weapons. There are also those ballistae and cannons. Even if we build siege chariots, it's one thing to say if we can break open the gates, but it's another thing to say if we can reach the gate. Speaking of this, Jiao Chuanzhen was clearly listless. He said listlessly, if it wasn't for those siege weapons, none of the 10,000 people who left the city would be able to return alive. Today's battlefield was no longer the Azura field that Jiao Jie was familiar with. The high walls of the city combined with all kinds of defensive equipment, even the endless beast tide would be worn down to death, let alone the generals who were good at charging and breaking through enemy lines. Taking down the reserve general of the Divine Forest Guards was just a warm-up for a fierce general like Jiao Jiezhen. But before he could vent his hot blood, the other side retreated back to Wei River City. Like a turtle that had retreated back into its shell, Jiao Jiezhen felt helpless despite his peerless martial prowess. Just make it so they can't use it. Lin Yuan opened his mouth and showed a cold smile. In the next moment, the originally calm Wei River suddenly boiled and roared. Water dragons roared into the sky, and in the blink of an eye, it was as if the entire Wei River had turned into a dragon and stood upright. Even Jiao Chuanzhen, who had been on the battlefield for a long time, couldn't help but gulp. No matter how strong a cultivator was, they couldn't fight against the heavens and earth. Even Kongming experts who didn't fear water or fire would lose to the corrosion of time. Lin Yuan's method of borrowing the power of the heavens and earth was almost beyond Jiao Chuanzhen's understanding. Using his own power to move the entire Wei River for his own use, what kind of terrifying power was this? Jiao Buzhen had seen similar battles before. It was just that at that time, the Falling Star Army was in its heyday. Nearly 10,000 cultivators of the water system were mobilized, and they only managed to turn a river less than 1/5 of the Wei River into a water dragon to help them attack the city. In that battle, they almost didn't encounter any decent resistance, because most of the soldiers and generals in the city had been drowned or knocked to death before they entered the city. While Wei River City would have corresponding defensive measures, with the Wei River pouring down, the siege weapons on the city walls should have been mostly destroyed. The cannons filled with water couldn't fire. In an instant, the battle returned to the rhythm he was familiar with. Trouble. The reserve officer of the Divine Forest Army on the city wall of Wei River City looked at the rising water dragons with a gloomy expression. This fortress built on the banks of Wei River couldn't be unguarded against the enemy using water to attack the city. The city had extremely advanced drainage channels. Once the water dragon pounced into Wei River City, it would quickly be swatted away by the drainage channels. But if such a terrifying water dragon came crashing down, the weapons on the city walls would definitely be destroyed, and the city gates might even be blasted open. The reserve officer took a deep breath and shouted, "Go to the storehouse and move rocks and sandbags to reinforce the city gates. Don't let the water dragons break open the gates." The elite soldiers selected from the various troops were naturally not weak. At the very least, they were able to withstand the pressure of the water dragons and not be killed on the spot. However, once the city gate was breached, it would not be a small matter for the people outside to rush in. For example, the general who led the team to scout the way was considered one of the strongest among them. However, he could not even last 3 moves against the silver-armored general. For these generals, cultivation didn't necessarily determine victory or defeat. Their mentality, martial arts skills, and even familiarity with battle formations would all determine victory or defeat on the battlefield. These were all very important factors. He didn't want to face the silver-armored general who was like a wolf or a tiger. The reaction of the officer on the city walls was very fast. But the moment he opened his mouth, the water dragons had already crashed down. The water dragons hit the city walls and suddenly exploded, turning into a large amount of water with a strong impact. It scattered the siege weapons on the city walls and washed away dozens of Shun Lin Jun's reserve soldiers who couldn't dodge in time. At the same time, they suddenly fell into the city. Most of them were drained away by the drainage system, but some of them hit the city gates hard. Jiao Buzhen and the Shun Lin Jun's reserve soldiers in the city all stared at the city gates. The city gates only shook twice but didn't break open. The officer on the city walls had a relieved expression on his face. But in the next moment, a white mist slowly rose. The Shun Lin Jun's body that was still wet suddenly had large and small ice cubes appear on their bodies. They shivered and the city gates directly turned into ice gates. "Charge!" Lin Yuan glanced at Jiao Buzhen beside him and ordered in a low voice. Jiao Buzhen was slightly startled, but he quickly recovered. Jiao Buzhen, who had already engraved obedience to orders in his bones, looked at the frozen city gates and directly turned over on his horse. He squeezed the horse's belly with his legs and roared, "Charge!" The 35,000 soldiers wearing the armor of the Fallen Star Army didn't hesitate. They followed closely behind Jiao Buzhen and launched a charge toward Wei River City. Lin Yuan pushed back more than 10 meters. He wrapped 2 huge logs with his tail and threw them toward the city gates fiercely. His speed was several times faster than the charging group of Fallen Star Army. They hit the frozen city gates one after another. With 2 crisp sounds, the city gates that separated the 2 armies instantly shattered into pieces. "Kill!" Jiao Buzhen's eyes lit up. The speed of his horse increased by 30% and rushed into Wei River City first. Jiao Buzhen held an 18-foot-long mace in his hand. It was also silver-white. With just one wave, 4 Shun Lin Jun who were originally near the city gates were smashed into pieces. The 300,000 Shun Lin Jun's reserve soldiers in the city couldn't even block for a moment. They were directly knocked to the ground by the Fallen Star Army. They originally hoped that the thick city gates would bring them enough protection, but the bloody reality slapped them hard in the face. The 2 officers of the Divine Forest Army took a deep breath and raised the weapons in their hands to meet Jiao Jiezhen. Although they weren't as strong as Jiao Buzhen in the original army, they were still very strong. Being rushed by the enemy as if they were in a no-man's land, they felt ashamed. Chapter 493. In the past, the champion of the Myriad Swords dynasty had earned his reputation from the battle of breaking through enemy lines. Not to mention him, even the 5,000 veteran soldiers of the Fallen Star Army that he had brought with him could easily deal with these so-called elites. After all, they were completely incomparable to the experienced soldiers of the Myriad Swords dynasty. Seeing the 2 strong men rushing towards him, Jiao Jiezhen was not in a hurry. He gently turned the mace in his hand and separated the 2 men's weapons. At the same time, he urged his war horse to charge forward. His left hand pulled the reins, and the war horse immediately reared up. Its 2 front hooves fiercely stamped on the chest of one of the generals, and immediately kicked him upside down. If it was Lin Yuan's body from his previous life, Being kicked like this by a war horse, even if the gods descended, they would not be able to save him. However, the soldiers of the Tianwu continent more or less had cultivation. Even if they were not in the Heaven Dipper realm, they could not be hurt by ordinary animals. The general was just careless and was sent flying, but he was not hurt at all. With a flip of his body, he regained his standing position. However, in this gap, Jiao Jiezhen turned the mace in his right hand and easily knocked away the spear in the other general's hand. He then pulled the mace back, and the front end of the mace fiercely smashed the general's head. Suddenly, the general's entire head was smashed. The general who had regained his battle stance saw that his comrade had ended up in such a miserable state. Although his eyes were red, his fear eventually won over his anger. He actually lost the courage to go forward and fight with Jiao Jiezhen. He turned around and ran towards the crowd. "Ha ha ha, where do you think you are going?" Jiao Jiezhen laughed for a while. His right hand just threw the mace forward, and in a flash, it hit the general's back. The general's body just trembled, and suddenly fell to the ground and died on the spot. A group of Shunlin Jun's reserve soldiers who came out with the two officers also trembled. No one dared to look at Jiao Jiezhen, this killing god. After all, in the Wei River city where elites walked everywhere, those who could become officers were all ruthless people. Even the reserve soldiers were not to be underestimated. They were either king soldiers from the original army, or they were the 1 in a million geniuses among the orphans adopted by Shunlin Jun. If the two officers were placed in Shunlin Jun's reserve force, they would be considered to be at the top. Even in the reserve force, they would be able to fight against 100 people. Even the generals in Shunlin Jun's main force would not be at a disadvantage. However, at that moment, the two of them did not even have a chance to fight back under the high level of force. If they were not arrogant and wanted to join Shunlin Jun's main force as officers, they could have gotten rid of the reserve force and started as soldiers in the main force. If they could do it all over again, these people would rather be part of the main force than stay in Wei River City and face a killing god like Jiao Jiezhen. Unfortunately, there was no chance to do it all over again. They would not know how much power Jiao Jiezhen had exerted when he fought with them. They would not know how big the gap was between them and those soldiers who were also killed in one move. Jiao Lijian was not in a hurry to retrieve his weapon. He just shook off the yellow and white substance on his right hand, and directly pulled out his sword from his waist and roared, "Brothers, teach this group of self-righteous little bastards what it means to be an elite. Kill. General Gao is invincible. Kill these little bastards." As the saying goes, a soldier is strong, but a general is strong. With such a ferocious general like Jiao Jie, not to mention the 5,000 experienced veterans of the Fallen Star Army, even the 30,000 new soldiers felt their blood boiling as if they had inexhaustible strength. Their opponents, who were well matched in strength, were no different from chickens and dogs in their eyes. Therefore, their attacks were much more vicious than before. Witnessing this scene, Lin Yuan nodded slightly with a touch of relief in his eyes. In terms of individual quality, except for the 5,000 veteran soldiers of Fallen Star Army, the rest of the 30,000 soldiers were probably not as good as Shunlin Jun's reserve force. But at this moment, the two sides could evolve from fighting back and forth to a one-sided massacre. This was the role of morale. Even between elites and trash, the biggest difference was not the quality, but whether they wanted to and dared to fight this battle. Obviously, Shunlin Jun's reserve force, who were scared out of their wits, could not come up with a way to deal with Jiao Jiezhen. Naturally, they lost their courage and changed from the initial formation to a timid look. These guys, do they have a backup plan? Lin Yuan paid attention to the movements in Wei River City and could not help narrowing his eyes slightly. In a desperate situation, human beings often made two different decisions. One was to kneel down and surrender, and the other was to fight to the death. But Shunlin Jun's reserve force in front of him did not want to continue to be entangled with Fallen Star Army, and on the other hand, did not want to surrender. They changed from being evenly matched to a turtle tactic, constantly shrinking the line of defense. As long as they could not fight, they would not fight. Obviously, these Shunlin Jun's reserve force had a third choice. However, a moment later, Lin Yuan was surprised to find that he didn't know what kind of materials were used to build Wei River City. His eye of God could observe Wei River City from above, but there was no way to penetrate the buildings or the ground to explore whether there was a tunnel under Wei River City that could evacuate from this place. Since he could not come up with anything real, Lin Yuan could only keep silent and not interfere with Jiao Zhezhen's battle. But he already knew that it was impossible to defeat these Shen Lin Jun's reserve force in one battle. Fortunately, he had other preparations. Without the strong protection of Wei River City, even if the Shen Lin Jun's reserve force could escape to various places in the north through the secret tunnel in the city, they could only be regarded as bandits who caused chaos. They could not do anything. Thinking of this, Lin Yuan could not come up with a solution at the moment. He could only let Jiao Zhezhen be the scapegoat. He could not order Jiao Zhezhen to disband the formation and attack the enemy's formation with all his strength, right? Not to mention the difference in military strength between the two sides, the military quality was even more incomparable. Once the formation was disbanded, it was not impossible for these Shen Lin Jun's reserve force to turn around and defeat Fallen Star Army. Lin Yuan would never make such a stupid decision. After all, Jiao Zhezhen was still very useful. And in a short time, he could not mobilize other troops to support Wei River City. Once they took back this city, this nail would be nailed to death. At that time, with the protection of Wei River City's defense equipment, most of the Shunwu dynasty could pass through Wei River and come to the north by boat. Even if they came in batches, it would be a bad result that Lin Yuan could not bear. Chapter 494. It was funny that 300,000 Shen Lin Jun's reserve soldiers were suppressed by 35,000 soldiers. No matter how many waves of counterattacks they organized, as long as they hit the 5,000 veteran soldiers of Fallen Star Army, all the attacks would be turned into nothing. Instead, they were pushed forward step by the opponent, gradually losing the geographical advantage of Wei City. Even the speed of shrinking the front line was accelerating. The way to deal with a fierce general was very simple. Let him be arrogant, go deep into the enemy's territory alone, and then encircle and kill him. But facing 5,000 fierce generals at the same time, as well as Jiao Zhezhen, who was one level higher than the fierce generals, could be said to be a peerless fierce general, and had extremely rich war experience, it was indeed a bit difficult for these little bastards. Looking at the whole Shunwu dynasty, only those old brothers in the past could compete with the 5,000 veteran soldiers of Fallen Star Army. But after decades, not everyone was as bad as Jiao Zhezhen and was excluded by the higher-ups. A small number of them retired and returned to their hometown. For example, the 5,000 soldiers of Fallen Star Army brought by Yang Xingqi were not implicated, but they were not willing to work for Lei Qiusheng. Most of them had now entered the army of Shunwu dynasty, and even held positions in the Ministry of War of the Imperial Court, and became important big shots. After years of living like royalty, how much courage could they still maintain? If it were not for the Shen Lin Jun and the small number of soldiers of Fallen Star Army. With this army, Lin Yuan could stand proudly in the north and rule across the river from Lei Qiusheng, and not be attacked by the Shuangjian barbarian. After all, if the strength of both sides was equal, neither Lin Yuan nor Lei Qiusheng would blindly break the balance, because that would only be taken advantage of by others. Neither of them could laugh until the end. But now the military strength of Shunwu dynasty was far above the northern frontier, but the speed of growth was far slower than the northern frontier. That was why Lei Qiusheng was anxious to suppress the northern frontier, and was determined to strangle this giant in the cradle. That was why the Frost Mirror Barbarian had entered the pass. But as the fighting became longer and longer, Jiao Zhezhen also got rid of the hot blood of returning to the battlefield, and looked at the problem with a calm attitude again. Soon, Jiao Zhezhen realized that something was wrong. The Divine Forest Army's reserves were losing members too fast. Jiao Zhezhen felt that even if these 35,000 people were replaced with the main force of the Fallen Star Army, they would not be able to cause such a huge loss of members. As the enemy's defensive line became smaller and smaller, their battle formation also became smaller and smaller. Sacrificing some soldiers in exchange for a chance to retreat. Jiao Chuanzhen frowned slightly, and his face suddenly turned cold. He raised the sword in his hand and said fiercely, "Everyone, follow me and charge." Seeing that Jiao Buzhen had sped up the attack, the commander of Shun Linjun's reserve force also understood that his abnormal speed of losing soldiers didn't escape the eyes of the enemy. But soon, a determined look flashed across his face, and he shouted, "This guy has found out our intention. It won't be so easy to escape. Quickly seal the tunnel and face the enemy." As the voice fell, nearly 40% of Shun Linjun's reserve force in the field were defeated. The enemy only had 35,000 people, and with the loss of soldiers during the battle, it was estimated that there were less than 30,000 people left now. Even if they were all unstoppable, it was impossible for them to have such a big appetite to eat all of them. Therefore, in their initial estimation, they only needed to lose about 30,000 to 40,000 soldiers to protect most of the good seedlings and escape from here. Therefore, the outermost army formation was basically made up of old guys with inferior cultivation aptitude. They were all veterans who were willing to sacrifice themselves. But after this order was issued, the rest of the soldiers who had the chance to retreat were suddenly a little unhappy. Especially the few officers who were about to enter the tunnel. Their faces were so gloomy that it was almost dripping water. The commander's face was also gloomy, and he said coldly, "If those people rush in without caring about their lives, how long can we hold on? When we enter the tunnel, we will be caught. Not only will we have no way to survive, but we will also implicate our brothers who have already escaped." In the time it took to talk, the outermost line of defense had been completely torn apart. Under the incomparable charge of Jiao Buzhen, these so-called elites were just small soldiers who could kill dozens of soldiers with one strike. Seal the tunnel and prepare the camp. Although the face of the officer at the entrance of the tunnel was not good for a long time, his face was a little more relieved. Since this was fate, what was there to hesitate about? Even if he sacrificed himself in exchange for his brothers to escape, there would be a day when someone would avenge him. Yes, even if the situation had deteriorated to this point, these soldiers who had been instilled with the idea of being loyal to Lei Chousheng still did not think that the Shunwu dynasty would lose this war. Right now, they were just letting that Black Jiao be arrogant for a few more days. Without much hesitation, they decisively pulled down a mechanism. The tunnel entrance that was originally big enough for 3 to 4 people to pass through collapsed in an instant. The original entrance was already covered by sand, and it would take at least half a day to dig out the entrance again. Damn it! The sound of the tunnel entrance being destroyed was not small, and Jiao Buzhen could clearly feel the tremors under his feet. Almost instantly, Jiao Buzhen guessed what those people had done and could not help but curse with a gloomy face. Outside the city, Lin Yuan also felt the change and guessed that the mechanism in the city had been destroyed. Although it was a pity, he could only shake his head lightly and sneered, "If you want to wedge a nail, then so be it. Why did you have to choose to do it near Wei River? Courting death." In fact, the Shunwu dynasty had never considered the hidden dangers in the north. After all, the aristocratic families in the north were generally weaker than the south, and there was also the Hengduan Mountains in the north. Therefore, the only force in the north that could threaten the Shunwu dynasty was the Frost Mirror Barbarian. Wei River City was a fortress built by Lei Chousheng. Not only was it used as a base for Shun Linjun, but it could also be used as a refuge for the descendants of the Lei family. Lei Chousheng had never thought that the situation would deteriorate to the point that Shun Linjun had to leave his base. He also did not expect that the Hengduan Mountains, where there were many birds and beasts, would give birth to an anomaly like Lin Yuan. He actually used his own strength to mobilize the Wei River for his own use. He also did not expect that Lin Yuan did not mobilize all of his military forces to fight against the Shuangjian barbarian when the Frost Mirror barbarian invaded. Instead, he maintained his conquest of the entire northern territory. All kinds of situations that Lei Chousheng had never thought of piled up together led to the fall of this so-called impregnable fortress. Chapter 495. However, the fall of the fortress was only the first step. Jiao Chuanzhen quickly rushed to the entrance of the tunnel. He frowned and thought for a moment. Then, He found some soldiers who were still energetic and began to dig the ground. After 2 hours, they finally cleared out all the sand, revealing a dark and endless tunnel. Jiao Chuanzhen's face showed a little joy. The joy on Jiao Chuanzhen's face didn't last long. He calmly sent a group of soldiers down to explore the tunnel. He also told them that no matter if they met Shen Linjun's reserve soldiers, they should send someone back to report every half an hour. However, after several groups of people went down, not a single person came back to report. This made Jiao Chuanzhen's heart turn cold. Because he didn't even hear the sound of fighting. In addition, he sent 3,000 to 4,000 people. It was impossible for them to not even have a chance to retreat before being wiped out by Shen Linjun's reserve soldiers. Then, the only possibility was that there was something wrong with this tunnel. After reorganizing his thoughts, Jiao Chuanzhen chased away the joy of victory from his mind. He did indeed remember some rumors about Lei Qiusheng when he was building this fortress that was known as impregnable. At the beginning of the construction, the designer had built many secret tunnels filled with traps in Wei River City. Unless one had the original blueprints, one might die from the traps if they entered the tunnels. Even if one's cultivation was high enough that the traps couldn't do anything to them, it was easy to get lost in the labyrinthine tunnels. After that, in order to keep it a secret, even the designer was secretly executed by Lei Qiusheng. Only Shen Linjun's generals and temporary commanders knew the structure of the tunnels. These people were basically going to serve Shen Linjun for life until they died of old age. Their purpose was to ensure the absolute safety of this tunnel. After thinking this through, Jiao Chuanzhen could only bitterly laugh twice and accept the fact that he didn't want to accept. There was no way to break this tunnel. Either he got the blueprint or he could only leave it alone. In this battle, nearly 100,000 Shen Linjun's reserve troops were annihilated. However, after the rest of the troops escaped into the underground tunnel, even a general like Jiao Buzhen who had been through hundreds of battles couldn't help but hesitate. He didn't even know how to face Lin Yuan. After all, they didn't know how long these tunnels were, how many changes there were, and where the exit at the other end of the tunnels was. Moreover, after losing 3,000 to 4,000 men, Jiao Zhezhen didn't dare to take any more risks with his brothers. The only thing they could be sure of was that no matter how long this tunnel was, it couldn't go all the way to the Central Plains. After all, they didn't know how deep the Wei River was, and it was impossible for them to go around it. If they really dug such a deep tunnel, it wouldn't be able to provide enough support, and it could collapse at any time. At that time, not only would they not be able to protect the tunnel, even the fortress above ground would be destroyed together with it. Therefore, it was impossible for these Shen Linjun's reserve troops to return to the Central Plains. They could only go to different places in the north through different secret tunnels, and then become a nail that was nailed into the palm of the northern frontier. Although Jiao Zhezhen already knew that he couldn't do his best in this battle, the two sides were in a deadlock here. Compared to the Shen Linjun's reserve troops escaping from under his nose, it was two different things. The former was just a lack of troops and siege equipment, but the latter was tantamount to pointing at his nose and calling him a piece of trash. Jiao Zhezhen, who was helpless, could only secretly spit and curse. They claimed to be invincible, but in the end, they dug so many rat holes in the ground. They want to be a whore and set up a monument to their chastity. It doesn't matter. They're just a group of defeated soldiers. At most, they'll be disgusting, but they won't be a big problem. Lin Yuan, who walked in from outside the city, comforted Jiao Zhezhen and said with a chuckle, "Old Jiao, I'll leave the construction of the defense line along the river to you. You must come up with your first plan within 3 days. This is your chance to become famous in the northern frontier. Although Li Zhong and the others will definitely raise objections, if you can make it perfect and pass it with a unanimous vote, then the impact on your future will definitely be different from the subsequent plans that need to be modified and pieced together." Hearing Lin Yuan's words, Jiao Zhezhen's face also turned red, which was rare. Although he was ostracized in the Shunwu dynasty for decades, this didn't mean that Jiao Zhezhen didn't care about fame. If that was the case, then why did he join the Fallen Star Army in the first place? Why did he have to risk his life to become a champion? Yang Xingqi had been exiled in the northern frontier for decades. Although his old subordinates still respected him, his prestige was not as high as before. Otherwise, under Yang Xingqi's call, there would be more than just Jiao Jiezhen and his 5,000 brothers who came to the northern frontier to join Lin Yuan. What really attracted Jiao Jiezhen was the talent selection system of the northern frontier. In the northern frontier, one's background, wealth, status, and even reputation didn't matter much. If one wanted to become a real person in the northern frontier, then one needed to have enough ability. As a former champion, Jiao Jiezhen was confident that he could occupy a place in the northern frontier military. However, after the establishment of the Northern Frontier Academy, Jiao Jiezhen saw many talents in the field of military studies. This made him worry about his future position. His only advantage now was that he had rich experience on the battlefield. Moreover, he didn't need to study those basic courses on the battlefield to be able to directly enter the battlefield. If he couldn't establish his own authority now, then when the northern frontier was filled with bright stars in the future, he wouldn't have much room to do. And now, the defense line along the river was bound to become the first battlefield against the main forces of the Shunwu dynasty. Whether or not the northern frontier could withstand the first round of the Shunwu dynasty's counterattack would depend on how far-sighted this defense line plan was. Whether or not it could make the generals of the Shunwu dynasty rack their brains to think of a way to defeat them. As long as they could withstand the first round of the Shunwu dynasty's counterattack, even if the defense line was destroyed in the following tug-of-war, Jiao Jiezhen could rely on this contribution to become one of the future generals of the northern frontier. Moreover, it would be an extremely dazzling one. It would definitely be more valuable than a champion in name only. Moreover, this defense line not only had to be impenetrable, but it also had to be exquisitely designed and inexpensive. Otherwise, with the financial resources of the northern frontier, if they wanted to carry out the Great Wall plan and the defense line along the river at the same time, there was no doubt that they would be unable to make ends meet. It was even possible that next year's financial resources would be overdrawn to the point of a deficit. Jiao Jiezhen dismounted from his horse and knelt in front of Lin Yuan on one knee. He clasped his fist and said, "This subordinate is not talented. I can only repay the Dragon King with my life." Chapter 496. Apart from the brief interlude in Wei River City, the entire northern battlefield had entered a white-hot zone. The yarrow beasts and demi-human warriors hiding in the forest taught the Frost Mirror barbarians a good lesson. For the first time, the Frost Mirror barbarians personally experienced that war wasn't as simple as being completely annihilated by the other side or completely annihilated by the other side. Under the command of the graduates of the Northern Frontier Academy, the demi-human army methodically divided the Frost Mirror barbarian army into pieces of meat that made them drool. Then, taking advantage of the terrain where the enemy's warhorses weren't suitable for charging in the mountains and forests, as well as the overwhelming advantage of the Northern Frontier's armaments, the demi-human army slowly devoured the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers who dared to enter the mountains and forests. After losing nearly 200,000 soldiers, the Frost Mirror barbarian commanders also learned of the strategy of don't enter the forest. They didn't give the northern frontier a chance to divide and tear them apart, and took the initiative to disperse their forces and occupy the plains. In this way, the northern frontier army's lack of training was highlighted, and the quality of the soldiers was uneven. After all, in a large battle, your fellow soldiers and comrades would give you a chance to fill in the gaps. But in a small-scale battle, everyone couldn't even take care of themselves. Who would have the time to clean up your mess? However, the setback on the northern frontier was within everyone's expectations, and they didn't fall into a disappointing situation. They changed their previous aggressive attitude and concentrated their forces in the mountains and forests, or stationed them in places that the army had to pass through. In any case, they didn't continue to engage in small-scale battles with the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers. This made the Shuangjian barbarian soldiers suffer, because their primary mission in the northern frontier wasn't to suppress the northern frontier, but to find the 13th prince. The 13th prince was the Frost Mirror Khan's favorite son, and he was even called Batu on the grassland, which meant the warrior of the grassland. In the Frost Mirror grassland where power determined status, Having such a son ensured that Shuang Jahan would be able to protect his Shualiao tribe from being swallowed up by other tribes even if he was pulled down from the throne of Great Khan by other tribes. After all, the 13th Prince's Shualiao cavalry was a tough nut to crack. Anyone who wanted to chew on them would have to grind their teeth off. Those tribes wanted to preserve their strength, so they naturally wouldn't engage in a bloody battle with the Shualiao tribe. But now, they were trapped in the northern plains, unable to advance even half a step. Moreover, they did not know what was happening behind them. Even their supply line had been cut off by the Northern Frontier Army. Until now, not a single grain of rice had been sent in. Seeing that their rations were about to run out, they had no choice but to kill extra war horses to satisfy their hunger. But where would they find extra war horses? The Shuangjian barbarian soldiers could only kill the exhausted war horses and replace their mounts with the other 2 war horses that had not ridden into the northern frontier. This was tantamount to drinking poison to quench thirst, because if they didn't change their mounts, the most fatal problem for the cavalry would be their stamina problem. Originally, they could still plunder the cities in the northern frontier, but Li Zhong's strategy of erecting walls and clearing the wilderness left only a few troops disguised as Shenwu dynasty soldiers in the northern frontier. There was only a small amount of rations left, and it wasn't even enough to fill the gaps between their teeth. These soldiers who stayed behind to guard the northern frontier were basically doing it voluntarily. Their bravery was unparalleled, so it wasn't easy to chew on a hard bone, and even if they did, they wouldn't be full. After a few losses, they gave up on those cities. They didn't even know what to do with the captives they caught. It would be a waste to kill them. After all, although the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers were good at fighting in the wilderness, they were not good at sieging cities. They didn't know that the northern frontier had removed the city walls, so they naturally had to keep a certain number of cannon fodder and slaves to prepare for a war of attrition against the cities of the northern frontier. It was exactly the same strategy as the beast tied when attacking human cities. Therefore, it wasn't unreasonable for them to be called barbarians. Apart from looking like humans, they were almost no different from monsters in the eyes of the other 6 great empires. But if they kept these people alive, they would have more food to feed. If this went on, they might even eat humans with bloodshot eyes. Before these Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers entered the northern frontier, they naturally didn't know that the aristocratic families and sects in the northern frontier had already been wiped out by Li Zhongsheng. Under the operation of the embroidered uniform guards, all the wealth accumulated by those aristocratic families had been swallowed up by Lin Yuan. As long as the people in the cities were evacuated, the entire northern frontier would instantly become a battlefield. Without the obstruction of the aristocratic families and sects, this step was particularly easy. After all, no one wanted to live on the battlefield. There was no guarantee that they would lose their lives at any time. The supplies were transported by the supply caravans, and the routes of the supply caravans were basically in the mountains or places where there were large numbers of soldiers. With just these Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers, it was impossible for them to steal anything without paying a heavy price. Moreover, several times before they succeeded, the soldiers of the northern frontier actually set fire to the caravans and even fought directly on the burning caravans. In the end, the soldiers and the caravans were burned to ashes together. They didn't give them any supplies at all. In particular, these supply caravans were all from the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce. These guys who had been traveling in the Hengduan Mountains all year round were not to be trifled with. They had to be on guard at all times against demonic beasts or other forces in the northern frontier. Their fighting ability in the mountains and plains was not much worse than the demi-human army and demonic beasts. They were the toughest of the toughest. After all, the 13th prince had been lost in the northern frontier. Now, even the main forces of the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers were having such a hard time, let alone the 13th prince, who they had lost contact with for a long time. At this moment, most of the Shuangjian barbarian soldiers believed that the 13th prince, who had lost contact with the Frost Mirror grassland, had most likely died at the hands of the people of the northern frontier. Even the Bloodridge Knights, who were originally from the Bloodridge tribe, didn't believe that the 13th prince was still alive. After this period of fighting, The people of the northern frontier were fiercer and more barbaric than the Shuangjian barbarian soldiers. Many of the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers were even thinking of retreating. They felt that it was useless to continue staying in the northern frontier. It was better for them to go back and recuperate. Although the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers were allocated with 3 horses per person, they couldn't eat all of them. Although the people of the grassland knew how to fight, if they wanted to cross the Frost Mirror grassland on foot without horses, it was no different from suicide. The Shuangjian barbarian soldiers were gloomy. They even began to secretly complain about their ally, the Shunwu dynasty. After all, they had agreed to it on the surface. Until now, the Shunwu dynasty had not sent a single soldier to put pressure on the northern frontier. Otherwise, the Shuangjian barbarian soldiers would never have fallen to such a miserable state. Chapter 497. The war gradually reached its climax, but the Shunwu dynasty still didn't make a move. It wasn't that they didn't want to take this opportunity to attack the northern frontier, but the Frost Mirror barbarian troops entering the central plains were like fish entering water. Fighting cavalry in the endless plains was undoubtedly foolish. Thus, the Shunwu dynasty's army could only choose to retreat and defend the cities, leaving large areas of wilderness and villages to the Frost Mirror barbarian troops. However, even though most of the cities in the central plains were much more prosperous than the small cities in the north, their defensive capabilities couldn't be compared. They couldn't withstand the attacks of tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of Frost Mirror barbarian troops. Almost every now and then, news of a city falling would reach the imperial capital. A group of aristocratic family heads, sect disciples, and nobles were all cowering in the temporarily safe imperial capital, trembling in fear. Although the Shunwu dynasty's imperial capital seemed to be absolutely safe for the time being, even the monarch, Lei Qiusheng, was aware of the problem. As the instigators, how could they not know how much the imperial army in charge of protecting the imperial capital had been corrupted by them? It would be safer for them to go up and fight against the ferocious Shuangjian barbarian troops rather than rely on those young masters to climb up the city walls and fight against the ferocious Shuangjian barbarian troop. In an instant, the entire imperial capital was covered in a gloomy cloud of gloom. According to the style of these aristocratic families, they didn't care about anything other than their own land. If not for the fact that Lei Qiusheng was a powerful and tyrannical monarch, some people would have already begun to force Lei Qiusheng to give up large amounts of territory and recall the border troops to resist the Shuangjian barbarian troops. As for the consequences of doing so, they didn't care and didn't want to care. In any case, dying a few years later was better than dying now. I wonder what the situation is like in the north. A commander of the Blood Liao cavalry carefully wiped his blood-stained scimitar clean on an animal skin before slowly sheathing it. Behind him were countless ferocious Blood Liao knights, as well as an even larger number of disheveled, and demoralized slave soldiers. In front of them was a burning city. Judging from the tall and wide walls, this city definitely had a high status in the Central Plains. However, not only did this rich city fail to stop the Frost Mirror barbarians' advance, it only served to increase their desire to plunder. After all, even though the Shunwu dynasty might not be as rich as the entire Shuangjian dynasty, a city in the Shunwu dynasty was definitely richer than a tribe in the Frost Mirror Prairie. Even the Frost Mirror Khan's Blood Liao tribe was no exception. These Frost Mirror barbarian who had entered the Central Plains were living a much better life than their compatriots in the north. They ate until their mouths were full of oil, and they continued to collect large amounts of wealth. Once the higher-ups gave the order to retreat, they could leave at any time. With the wealth they plundered, they could at least raise the strength of the entire tribe by 2 levels. In addition, the public opinion that Lin Yuan had carefully created also exploded at this moment. Almost all the people believed that the border army had already been defeated. Otherwise, it would be impossible for so many barbarians from the northern frontier to enter the Central Plains. Many people didn't even wait for the Frost Mirror barbarian to continue moving south. They had already spontaneously started migrating further south. This move was absolutely fatal to the current Shunwu dynasty. The north was already out of control, and the south was in endless chaos. If even the people in the Central Plains fled, it would mean that the Shunwu dynasty wouldn't receive a single grain tax in the coming year. Apart from shamelessly asking for peace with Lin Yuan and acknowledging his control over the north, they could only earn resources through the sea trade route in the south. Otherwise, they would all have nothing to eat next year. Lei Qiusheng had no choice but to order officials at all levels to appease the people. At the same time, the border army in the north was on full alert to resist the Shuangjian barbarian reinforcements with all their might. The situation in the Central Plains was indeed stabilized in a short period of time. At the very least, the number of Frost Mirror barbarian troops no longer increased. After the supply line was cut off, they were no longer as difficult to deal with as before. With the garrisons in each city, they could still hold on for a while. At the very least, the situation in the Central Plains would not happen again. But at the same time, they had also blocked the Frost Mirror barbarians' path to invade the northern frontier. This immediately reduced the pressure on the northern frontier. And the Frost Mirror barbarian invaders were right to complain about their allies because it was the Shunwu dynasty that had cut off their supply line. There was no other way. After all, the place where the barbarians invaded was the source of the Wei River. If the defense line in the north remained open, these barbarians could cross the Wei River and enter the Central Plains at any time. Therefore, if they wanted to stop the Frost Mirror barbarians' attack, they couldn't leave any openings. This time, it could be said that Lei Qiusheng had shot himself in the foot. Not only did he not cause the northern region to be unable to recover from this setback, but he had also suffered enough. Every day, he had a sickly look on his face and did not even attend court if he could. After all, once the officials gathered, there would always be an imperial censor who would come out to question him. Why were the 700,000 Frost Mirror barbarian able to bypass the border army's defenses and plunder the Central Plains? Why did the Shunwu dynasty suffer such heavy losses? Why didn't they send out a decent army to win 2 battles to vent their anger? Of course, Lei Qiusheng wouldn't say that this was a plan he had prepared to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. First, he could let the Frost Mirror barbarian invade the north and delay Lin Yuan's annexation of the north. This would give him enough time to pacify the south or mobilize his troops to fight the northern frontier. In addition, Lei Qiusheng had previously used his connections to transfer a group of Bloodliao knights into the northern frontier. It was as if a knife was hanging over his head. He wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to reorganize the northern defense line and get rid of all the generals who were close to Lei Qiusheng in one fell swoop before replacing them with trusted subordinates. But he didn't expect the Shuangjian barbarian to do this repeatedly. Not only did he want to attack the north, he didn't even let off his ally. After all, Lei Qiusheng couldn't announce that all this was because of his own mistakes, could he? In that case, how could he still be the emperor? Moreover, as a political expert, Lei Qiusheng could naturally see the real side of the matter from the layers of appearances. For example, the seemingly sharp questions of the imperial censor were actually just a prelude. Once the time was right, those aristocratic families would force him to cede a large amount of land to the Shuangjian dynasty and the Qingjiang dynasty in exchange for peace. Anyway, the one who would lose was the Shunwu dynasty, not the aristocratic families. Now that the Shunwu dynasty was in danger, if they continued to support Lei Qiusheng to fight on 2 fronts, and at the same time become enemies with the northern frontier, the inheritance of the aristocratic families that had been passed down for hundreds or even thousands of years would be destroyed in their hand. Of course, after this main goal was achieved, they would propose to withdraw the troops in various regions. It seemed that they wanted to reduce the expenditure of the national treasury, but in fact, they wanted Lei Qiusheng to disperse his cultivation and gradually lose the ability to suppress the aristocratic family's troop. Chapter 498. This was the main reason why Lei Qiusheng detested the aristocratic families. Lin Yuan was thinking of ways to eliminate different voices at the northern frontier. However, within the Shunwu dynasty, various factions were thinking of ways to weaken Lei Qiusheng's power. They didn't seek to pull Lei Qiusheng down from the throne, but at least they wanted to prevent Lei Qiusheng from killing them as he wished. Of course, people were greedy and insatiable. Once they weakened Lei Chosheng's power step by step, the next thing they would do would be to covet the sacred artifacts and experience the feeling of taking turns to be the emperor. Lei Chosheng was even a little envious of Lin Yuan. Although the northern frontier wasn't big, after a series of purges and suppression, the entire northern frontier was under Lin Yuan's control. If he wanted to fight a war, it would be fought. If he wanted to fight a war, it would be fought for as long as he wanted. No one dared to say anything. This was because the aristocratic families in the northern frontier were relying on Lin Yuan to survive. Once Lin Yuan fell from power, the entire northern frontier would be weakened and destroyed. This kind of method of attaching an entire force to a single person was extremely stupid. Once there was no outstanding successor, then the speed of the force's growth would be the same as the speed of its collapse. Lei Chosheng knew that this method was stupid, but he still dreamed of becoming such an emperor. However, he was helpless. Back then, he was able to ascend to the throne by relying on his military power. However, with the abilities of those big shots, it was impossible for them to govern the region. Therefore, he could only use a large number of talents from the aristocratic families and sects. This resulted in the current situation where he couldn't get rid of his subordinates. Zhong Xiu, Lei Chosheng, who was pacing back and forth in Yangshan Palace Hall, subconsciously called out. However, a trace of sadness quickly appeared on Lei Chosheng's face. That person was no longer here. Actually, putting aside the fact that he was a surviving member of the Zhao clan, Zhong Xiu had done his best under Lei Chosheng. He had managed the embroidered guard from nothing to a ferocious tiger that everyone feared. Although it couldn't be separated from Lei Chosheng's great support behind him, it was enough to show that Zhong Xiu wasn't an embroidered pillow like Lin Yuan had described him to be. On the contrary, Zhong Xiu was a great talent with real talent. Moreover, after decades of getting along with each other, the stubborn Lei Chosheng had also treated Zhong Xiu as one of his few friends. Although they were not as close as Shadow, who had grown up together, they were still closer than Lei Chosheng. Now that there was a problem with the war strategy, Lei Chosheng sadly discovered that he couldn't even find someone to discuss it with. After a while, Lei Chosheng walked out of Yangshan Palace Hall with bloodshot eyes and strode to the Yamen of the Servants' Administration. "Greetings, Your Majesty." The Servants' Administration wasn't just one of the two intelligence agencies in Lei Chosheng's hands. It was also a place that trained eunuchs and palace maids to serve the imperial family, nobles, and even high-ranking officials. For people born in this place, they had to remember the faces of even the students who had passed the imperial examinations but hadn't had the chance to be promoted. How could they be blind when facing Lei Chosheng, the ruler of a country? Lei Chosheng waved his hand, indicating for the eunuchs and palace maids to stand up. At the same time, he asked, "Where is my Shenlin Jun now? How long will it take for him to return?" However, the response to Lei Chosheng was a deathly silence. Suddenly, Lei Chosheng's heart skipped a beat. There was even a hint of panic on his face. As his trump card, Shenlin Jun's importance to him was self-evident. If something happened to Shenlin Jun, not to mention the covetous eyes of the two empires, even Lin Yuan could step on his head and abuse his power. "Speak." Lei Chosheng fiercely stomped his foot, shattering a white jade tile as he roared in annoyance. An old eunuch with snow-white hair trembled as he knelt on the ground. He said bitterly, "Your Majesty, after Shenlin Jun received Your Majesty's decree, he was stopped by Eunuch Tai before he could leave. I'm afraid he won't be able to return in a short period of time." Hearing that his shadow had left Shenlin Jun in the south at such a time of crisis, Lei Chosheng's face didn't reveal any strange expression. However, his heart grew heavier and heavier. This was because the shadow's action meant that there was an even bigger mess in the south. It was no longer a problem that could be solved by killing Lei Chosheng or wiping out a few aristocratic families. The old eunuch quietly raised his head. When he saw that Lei Chosheng hadn't delivered the goods, he lowered his head again and said, "According to the news that Eunuch Tai sent a while ago, those evil cultists who were banished overseas have now returned to the south to preach. Currently, a large number of people have already joined them. Eunuch Tai said that there are countless rebel armies in the south. There is no army that can be trusted. Only Shenlin Jun, who is loyal to your majesty to the death, can take on this great responsibility and eliminate those evil cultists. Evil. Teach. Disciple. The moment these three words appeared, Lei Chousheng only felt that his brain had exploded with a buzzing sound. His vision instantly turned white. As the actual ruler of the Shunwu dynasty, he knew too many secrets that others didn't know. He was very clear that the top forces who called themselves the Guardians of the Heavenly Gates were mortal enemies with these evil cultists. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that both sides had an irreconcilable hatred. They definitely wouldn't sit by and watch the evil cultists develop and grow stronger in the south. They wouldn't even let them enter the south. But now, not only had the evil cultists entered the south, they had even started to preach in the south. No one had come out to control them. Even the shadow had no choice but to disobey Lei Chousheng's orders and intercept Shen Linjun. He was prepared to let them take on the responsibility of eliminating the evil cultists at any time. However, the attitude of the Guardians of the Heavenly Gates had already explained many things. Since they could tolerate the evil cultists preaching in the south, it meant that they were willing to make almost any concessions other than directly sending troops to suppress the Shunwu dynasty. Lei Chousheng opened his mouth and laughed bitterly. The sound coming from his throat was like a broken bellows. Your Majesty. The old eunuch raised his head with a worried expression. He looked at Lei Chousheng, who had changed his usual shrewd style. He felt as if he was being chased, and his heart was tightly clenched. After all, these eunuchs grew up and learned in the palace. Their loyalty to Lei Chousheng was definitely no less than that of Shen Linjun. It might even surpass that of Shen Linjun. After all, Shen Linjun was a professional soldier. He could still live well without Lei Chousheng. Even if he retired and went to a remote city to be a demon slayer or a mercenary, he could still live a good life. However, these eunuchs were different. Without Lei Chousheng, they were just a group of lonely disabled people with no one to rely on. Even if their cultivation was high and their wealth was comparable to that of a country, they would still end up with no one to send them off in their old age. Their power, their lives, and even their everything were linked to Lei Chousheng. Naturally, they had to think about Lei Chousheng at all times. Chapter 499. This humble one is doing very well. Lei Chousheng finally regained some clarity after hearing the old eunuch's call. However, he felt an inexplicable sadness in his heart. No matter how he viewed himself, the current rotten situation had become a mess that was difficult for him to clean up. This was especially true after Lin Yuan revealed his ambitions. Lei Chousheng was in a state of panic and had taken many remedial measures. However, the more he did, the more mistakes he made, which led to the current situation. Even though Lei Chousheng knew that as long as he had enough time to deal with the south, even if Lin Yuan completely took over the north, he would still have the strength to fight. However, the enormous pressure that had been accumulating in his heart day after day made Lei Chousheng, blinded by greed, choose to open the border. He gritted his teeth and let the Frost Mirror Barbarian into the country, but he didn't expect that he would shoot himself in the foot. His originally resentful attitude completely changed after hearing the news of the southern evil cultists. He originally only treated Lin Yuan as an equal opponent, but he didn't expect that Lin Yuan's plans were even greater than his. The cultists had even bypassed him and directly contacted the most powerful forces. If the shadow had not happened to be in the south, it was likely that the cultists would have caused a huge ruckus before the report would appear on the shadow's desk. Because at this moment, Lei Chousheng clearly understood that it wasn't just Lin Yuan. Even the civil and military officials of the court, as well as the top-level factions, all thought of him as the loser before the war even began. None of you are optimistic about this humble one's chances. This humble one is going to win this war no matter what. Lei Chousheng suddenly took a deep breath and said in a low voice, Eunuch Shui, this humble one doesn't have any trustworthy people by his side right now. I can only trouble the servants' administration to make a trip to the northern border. Have the troops there withdraw in batches to the central plains and defend the imperial capital to the death. Without this humble one's orders, no one is allowed to fight on their own. Those who disobey will have their entire family executed. The old eunuch called Eunuch Shuo was shaken. He looked at Lei Qiusheng in disbelief, as if this was the first time he had met this person. I am very clear-headed now. I know the consequences of doing so. Lei Qiusheng gritted his teeth and fiercely said, "Didn't they look down on me? They want this humble one's beautiful country, but this humble one will not give it to them. Even if they are lucky enough to beat this humble one this time, this humble one will leave them with a terrible mess." Yes. Eunuch Shuo lowered his head again and pressed his forehead against the ground, trying to control his emotions. He wasn't sure what Lei Qiusheng was feeling right now, but he was sure that Lei Qiusheng wasn't clear-headed at the moment. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made such a decision that harmed others without benefiting himself. He wouldn't have chosen to give up on all his plans at this time. However, Eunuch Shuo did not have Eunuch Tai's cultivation, nor did he have Zhong Xiu's forbearance, nor did he have Li Zhong's wisdom. He was just a loyal official, a foolish loyal official. Thus, even though he knew that Lei Qiusheng's decision was wrong, Eunuch Shuo did not speak up to dissuade him. On the Frost Mirror grassland far away from the Shunwu dynasty, in the royal tent of the Shuiliao tribe, a man who seemed to be in his 30s was holding a book in his left hand and a white stone in his right. His brows were furrowed as he sat in the tent in deep thought. But he was the only person in the tent. No one knew who he was playing Go with, or what he was thinking about. The man's skin was white and delicate, as smooth as milk. He didn't seem like a child of the grassland who had been tempered by the sun and wind day and night. Instead, he seemed like one of those scholarly Confucian disciples from the south of the Shunwu dynasty. He even wore a moon-white brocade robe, the style of which had been popular in the Shunwu dynasty last year. However, the material used was even more luxurious and expensive than the vast majority of high-class cloth shops. One could tell at a glance that it was no ordinary item. Even more inconceivable was that the book in the man's hand was not some incomprehensible Go manual, nor was it a Confucian classic. Instead, it was a book that could be seen everywhere on the northern frontier and that no one dared to disobey, the new laws of the northern frontier. Third Prince, the Blood Eagle has sent back a message. A Frost Mirror barbarian wearing a leather coat and iron armor placed a stack of parchment in front of the man. Without waiting for him to speak, the Frost Mirror barbarian cupped his fists and left the tent. The man acted as if he hadn't heard anything. His brows were still furrowed as he pondered for an incense stick's worth of time. Suddenly, his eyes lit up and he gently placed the white stone in his hand on the chessboard. The entire chessboard instantly came to life. The white stone that had been in a disadvantageous position suddenly twisted and turned into a killing move. At this point, the man finally put down the book in his hand. He stood up and walked to a copper basin to wash his hands with water. Then, he used a piece of dry animal skin to wipe the water off his hands. Only then did he return to his soft couch and sit down. He picked up the stack of parchment and began to read. It wasn't until he finished reading the last parchment that the man slowly exhaled and murmured, "He's gone mad." The Blood Eagle was an intelligence agency that he had set up himself. However, Frost Mirror Barbarian wasn't good at intelligence. Even if he disguised himself, his skin and demeanor were completely different from those who lived in a world where birds sang and flowers bloomed. Therefore, there were very few secret agents and spies in the Shuangjian dynasty. Even if there were a few similar organizations, they were short-lived. They were either destroyed in an instant or slowly fell into a useless state. Even though his Blood Eagle could hide in the Shunwu dynasty, it still couldn't obtain first-hand information. This was also the reason why he could slowly think of a way to solve the chessboard after receiving the information about the Shunwu dynasty. However, based on this outdated information, he could draw several conclusions. Firstly, his valiant 13th brother was already confirmed dead. Second, the strength of the northern frontier was far beyond their imagination. It was estimated that none of the people who entered the north this time could come out. Third, Lei Qiusheng had gone mad. The first two pieces of information were already speculated by him. Even if they were confirmed now, they weren't worth mentioning. However, the last piece of information made him cautious. In addition to the information he received this morning, Lei Chouxing was going to withdraw the border army in the north and let them directly enter the rich and livable hinterland of the Shunwu dynasty to occupy territory and plunder treasures. In other words, Lei Chouxing was going to use the entire Shuangjian dynasty as a knife and let them be the executioners whose hands were stained with blood. For Lei Chouxing would get rid of all the major problems and directly reshuffle the power structure of the entire Shunwu dynasty. But what if he's not mad? The third prince's eyebrows, which had just relaxed, were tightly knitted together again. His expression was a little uncertain. He dared to use the Shuangjian dynasty as a knife. Wasn't he afraid that it was easier to invite the devil than to send the devil away? Chapter 500. The third prince sat in his own tent and frowned as he pondered. After a while, he realized that something was not right. How did Lei Chouxing end up like this? It was because the Qingjiang Empire and Shuangjian Empire had joined forces with the Hengduan Mountains and the Dragon Palace of the Four Seas to attack the Shunwu dynasty at the same time. As a result, even the basic garrison troops were transferred to the front line. Although the front line looked stable, the interior was as soft as mud. Not to mention the northern frontier king and the Qing Peng king, even the rebels could threaten Lei Chouxing's position. However, why would the four forces join forces to attack the Shunwu dynasty? With the third prince's wisdom that did not match that of the people in the grassland, he quickly thought of the top forces that were above the empire. It was obvious that Lei Chouxing had offended one of the top forces because of something. That was why there was a war everywhere, giving the aristocratic families and sects who coveted the high position space to cause trouble. After joining forces with Lei Chouxing, the situation gradually became clear. The thing that made the top forces hate the Shunwu dynasty so much that they used all their influence to make the four forces join forces should still be in Lei Chouxing's hands. Otherwise, both the Shuangjian Empire and the Qingjiang Empire would have withdrawn their troops and returned to the empire. After all, the monster horde in the Hengduan Mountains would not reason with them. Since they had no military strength, the neighboring empires would not miss this opportunity to loot a burning house. However, the strange thing was that the forces that bordered the Qingjiang Empire and the Shuangjian Empire did not attack them at all. It was only after they attacked the northern frontier that the monster horde broke out on the Shuangjian grassland again. All the signs pointed to the fact that the item was still in Lei Chouxing's hands. Also, the reason why he dared to take the risk was that the item could help him turn the tables after his plan of driving the wolves to devour the tigers. He could destroy the Frost Mirror cavalry that invaded the Shunwu dynasty. Thinking of this, the third prince's forehead was instantly covered in a fine layer of cold sweat. Shakily standing up from his soft couch, the third prince walked step by step towards the door of the tent. This was not because his body was weak. On the contrary, the fact that he was able to maintain his fair and smooth skin on the Frost Mirror grassland was not because he was talented. Rather, it was because the third prince had cultivated at a terrifying speed since he was a child. He was only in his 30s, but he had already reached the Heaven Star realm. With his stellar energy protecting his body, he was naturally impervious to the cold wind. In terms of cultivation alone, the third prince was probably the strongest of the Frost Mirror Kargan's many sons. Unfortunately, leading an army into battle did not depend on the cultivation of the general. There were many other factors that had to be considered. Although the third prince was not inferior to the 13th prince in terms of strategy and adaptability, the third prince was not inferior to the 13th prince in terms of motivation, morale, and courage. Therefore, the 13th prince was Batu Lu, and the third prince was just the third prince. Your Highness, why are you? The two Bloodspan knights in charge of guarding the tent paled when they saw the third prince walk out of the tent. On the Frost Mirror grassland, where the 13th prince's fate was unknown, the third prince could not become the first successor of the Bloodspan tribe. However, the cunning third prince controlled the Blood Eagles. With the cunning of a fox and the eyes of an eagle, the third prince was practically the brain of the entire Bloodspan tribe. He spent most of his time in his tent, processing the intelligence reports from the Blood Eagles and formulating a plan of action for the Bloodspan tribe. Unless something major was about to happen, the third prince rarely left his tent. After all, the intelligence reports were already outdated. If he did not check them in time and did not react in time, the entire tribe might be plunged into an unknown and desperate situation that concerned the survival of the tribe. The third prince looked at the guards with a pale face and said in a low voice, "This matter is of great importance. It is not convenient for me to meet with my father directly. I can only trouble you to go first and tell my father that no matter what he is doing, he is to postpone everything and wait for me. Just say that our Reflection Frost dynasty is in grave danger. If we don't handle this matter properly, not only the Bloodbath tribe, but all the other tribes on the Reflection Frost plains will be wiped out." What a guy! When the guards heard this, their faces instantly paled. The third prince never spoke without thinking. Now that he said this, it meant that a great disaster was about to happen on the Frost Mirror grassland. The guards did not know that the exhausted Shunwu dynasty would not be able to stop the Shuangjian dynasty from taking the imperial capital now that the army had moved out in full force. However, the third prince was never one to speak empty words. Many people even respected the third prince with titles such as prophet or sage. This was because the things that the third prince had predicted over the past 10 years were all reflected in the time and place that he had predicted. Yes, I will go and see the great Khan now. After all, the third prince's guards were the brains of the Bloodspan tribe. Although they only had the title of a guard, their status was not inferior to the generals other than the princes. As long as they reported to the great Khan, they would be able to see him. Also, the third prince turned to look in the direction of the Shunwu dynasty and said with a dark face, "We have to be prepared for both sides. My father has always favored the 13th prince, but it seems that he has died on the northern frontier. I am worried that my father will send troops out in anger and destroy all the tribes on the Frost Mirror grassland. Find a group of trustworthy people and inform the chiefs of the other tribes to come here for a meeting. Even if we have to force him, we cannot let my father continue this war." The guard trembled and his face paled, but his eyes flashed with determination. He said in a low voice, "Yes." Everyone knew that Shuangjian Khan favored the 13th prince. However, they were both Shuangjian Khan's sons. How could the third prince, who was the most talented and the wisest, not be interested in Shuangjian Khan's throne? If he succeeded in forcing the third prince to abdicate this time, he would have succeeded the third prince. As long as he could win this war, he would be a big shot in the Bloodspan tribe and even in the Shuangjian dynasty. When the time came, the third prince might even allow him to leave with his tribesmen and establish his own tribe. For a better life in the future, for a lord who could rule over a region. It was a gamble. The third prince, who did not know the guard's complicated thoughts, sighed as he watched the guard leave. He looked in the direction of the Shunwu dynasty and murmured, "I hope it is not too late." Chapter 501. If the Shuangjian dynasty could get their hands on information, the northern frontier would naturally be able to get their hands on it. In fact, they would be able to get their hands on it much faster. Looking at the report on the table that had been confirmed by the Association of the Demon Emperor and the embroidered uniform guard, Li Zhong's eyes were filled with doubt. Was Lei Choshen crazy, or was he making a huge gamble? Or was he trying to drag the northern frontier down with him? Li Zhong believed that a person at Lei Choshen's level wouldn't lose their will to fight just because of a momentary loss. He also didn't believe that Lei Choshen would make such a crazy decision. If that was the case, then he would have to wonder if the person who had invaded the country with a strong army was the current divine martial emperor Lei Choshen. Once the northern frontier army retreats back to the central plains, the Frost Mirror cavalry will be able to attack the Shunwu dynasty unscrupulously. Of course, they might also attack our northern frontier. Judging from the factors of this simultaneous invasion, the Shuangjian dynasty's tribes, big and small, should be more inclined to plunder the Shunwu dynasty, which is currently lacking in battle strength. However, the disappearance of the 13th prince will cause the Frost Mirror Khan to target the northern frontier. Lei Choshen's seemingly crazy move has hit the nail on the head. If we go to stop the Shuangjian dynasty, We will have to split off our already small forces to take over the defense line left behind by the Shunwu dynasty's frontier army. Not only will it be a waste of effort, but it will also be easy for Lei Chouxing to attack us. However, if we don't stop the Shuangjian dynasty, we will have to face the most elite Shueliao cavalry. Without the Shueliao knights who could contend against the divine marshal Chongbu, with the strength of the Shunwu dynasty's border army and Lei Chouxing's plans, it would be more than enough to defeat the Shuangjian dynasty's invasion. When the time came, Lei Chouxing would be able to reverse his decline and rebuild the morale of the army. Then, he would be able to find an opportunity to fight us head-on. Right now, the northern frontier's strength is barely enough to deal with Lei Chouxing, who has recovered 50% of his strength. Add to that the Blood Liao Knights attack, and we can't mobilize more than 30% of our troops. Unless Uncle Gao's defensive fortifications along the river are miraculous, Lei Chouxing will be able to catch his breath and kill us with a single punch, Li Zhong muttered to himself. His eyes gradually regained their clarity. He said coldly, "What a Lei Chouxing." Everyone's wisdom was different, and the level at which they looked at problems was also different. Eunuch Shuo was on the first level, and he could only see the harm of Lei Chouxing's move. The third prince was on the second level, and he could see the harm of Lei Chouxing's move. He could also see the benefits from it and derive a series of calculations. Li Zhong was on the third level, and he directly eliminated the areas that were harmful to the Shunwu dynasty. He found the most crucial point and even used it to deduce the unfavorable situation the northern frontier would soon face. As for which level Lei Chouxing was on, perhaps only he himself knew. When an expert made a move, the truth would be revealed. Lei Chouxing had chosen between the north and the south to survive. On one hand, he catered to the north to force the south, but on the other hand, he was worried that the north would become too powerful and difficult to control in the future. Under this kind of worrying situation, no matter how good a card he played, it would be a lousy one. It would be very easy for Li Zhong, Lin Yuan, and other people with great wisdom to find the flaws, and then break his killing moves one by one and counterattack. Even at this point, not only had Lei Chouxing not solved the trouble in the south, he had not even mobilized Lei Chouxing and the rebel army in the south. If not for Lin Yuan's tit-for-tat by letting the cultists land in the south, perhaps the south would still be stable and waiting for Lei Chouxing to be forced into a corner by the northern frontier. At that time, no matter what conditions the aristocratic families in the south offered, Lei Chouxing would have to pinch his nose and accept them, and the scales of victory would begin to tilt towards the interest groups in the south. At that point, whether it was Lei Chouxing or Lin Yuan, they would both become losers. It was just a matter of who would lose more in the end. But at the moment when he was completely on the verge of defeat, Lei Chouxing was able to sweep away all his worries and boldly adopt the method of no construction without destruction to meet the attack of the northern frontier. Moreover, he changed his previous scheming attitude and chose to use an open and above-board scheme. He made the Shuangjian dynasty his butcher's knife. While suppressing the northern frontier and sweeping away the aristocratic families in the Central Plains, he concentrated his forces to defend the imperial city and the nearby territories. With the Shuangjian barbarians' fighting style of bullying the weak and fearing the strong, he was bound to bypass the imperial city, which was a fat piece of meat, and directly sweep through the territory of the interest groups in the south. The cultists, the Frost Mirror Barbarian, and the interest groups in the south would first fight each other, and then Lei Chouxing would suddenly close the door and beat the dogs, directly eliminating all the internal problem. Even the aristocratic families that gave him a headache were swept away by the Shuangjian barbarian. How many of them would be left unharmed? How many of them would dare to challenge Lei Chouxing? How could he count on the aristocratic families near the imperial city that Lei Chouxing was toying with? Moreover, the Shuangjian barbarian would not continue to attack the Shunwu dynasty. Instead, they would retreat to the Frost Mirror grasslands to lick their wounds. At that time, if the northern frontier still could not deal with the problem of the Blood Liao Knights, it would be a huge joke. Should he take this move or not? For the first time, Li Zhong felt that the wisdom he was so proud of was actually useless at this moment. He realized that compared to ambitious and ruthless characters like Lei Chouxing and Lin Yuan, he lacked the most crucial thing, courage. He did not want to waste his energy fighting the Shuangjian dynasty, but he also did not want to take the risk of Lei Qiusheng rebuilding his confidence. At this moment, he did not know what to do. "Your Highness, battle report." A guard strode into Li Zhong's office and placed a battle report on Li Zhong's desk. Li Zhong tore open the wax seal on the envelope and took out the letter. His face immediately turned ashen as if he had eaten a fly. While he was still making preparations, Lei Qiusheng had already begun to move. At present, most of the northern border army had been wiped out, and the rest were fighting as they retreated toward the central plains. After all, these border armies had been stationed at the border for many years and had encountered the barbarians of the Shuangjian dynasty more than once or twice in the wilderness. While they might not be evenly matched, they would not be routed so quickly. This is troublesome. This is really troublesome. Li Zhong felt his temples throbbing with pain. Lei Qiusheng had actually played a dirty trick right in front of them. According to Li Zhong's usual logic, Lei Qiusheng's orders would be delivered to the border by trusted officials, and then the border army commanders would have to verify the authenticity of the orders before destroying the fortifications and slowly retreating to the vicinity of the imperial capital. But just as he received news that Lei Qiusheng was cutting off all means of retreat, the border army had already moved. What did this mean? It meant that Lei Qiusheng had given the Northern Frontier Intelligence Agency a vicious slap to the face. Chapter 502. Lei Qiusheng's order had already bypassed the intelligence system of the Northern Frontier and reached the border army. He pretended to be in the servants' administration just to confuse the intelligence agency of the Northern Frontier. He wanted Li Zhong and the others to think about it for a while when they received the message. Then he would take advantage of the time to mobilize the border army. In this way, no matter how fast the Northern Frontier's response was, it would be a joke. Because the border army had started to retreat in an orderly manner. Could the Northern Frontier attack the border army under the pressure of the Shuangjian barbarian and cut off their retreat? If the Northern Frontier really had that kind of strength, how could they be forced to this step? At the same time, it was also a challenge. How many troops do we have left? Li Zhong looked up at the guard who didn't have time to retreat, looking very gloomy. The guard thought for a while and said bitterly, "The main force of the southern expedition is in the border army to carry out the plan of the Great Wall. Some of them are in the north to clean up the rebels or to entangle the Frost Mirror barbarian who got separated from the main force. The Falling Star Army is now surveying the terrain near Wei River City, preparing to build a position to resist the naval attack of the Shunwu dynasty. The subhuman army is fighting with the demon beasts, so some of them are scattered in the forests. It's hard to gather them in a short time. If Your Highness wants to mobilize the troops as soon as possible, only the Northern Army hasn't been mobilized yet." Li Zhong was now a criminal. Without Lin Yuan's permission, the 100,000 guards of the prince's mansion were not allowed to leave Shunning City. They had already made a mistake once. If they made another mistake, no matter how good Li Zhong's reputation was, no one would be able to keep his head. Luckily, the Northern Army in the Northern Frontier could be mobilized, though the guards couldn't be mobilized. Li Zhong thought for a while and scolded with a smile, "Mobilize the Northern Army? Then it's better not to do anything." The Northern Battlefront Army, which had just been expanded twice, was disbanded recently. Those experienced soldiers were all sent to the front line. Even the soldiers we lost in the rebellion of the three cities were sent from the Northern Battlefront Army. Do you think they still have people? Well, the guard touched his head and smiled. Even so, they are one of the three armies in the Northern Frontier. They can spare 100,000 soldiers, can't they? Your Highness, you think too much. He could tell that this prince didn't care about his own life at all. He knew that this was a job that would cost him his head, but he still wanted to take the 100,000 guards out and wrestle with the border troops of the Shunwu dynasty who had retreated back to the central plain. Li Zhong shook his head helplessly and smiled bitterly. The Northern Army can't even gather 600,000 soldiers, and they have to be stationed in different places in the Northern Frontier. It's a chaotic time. Who knows how many demons and monsters are going to cause trouble? Almost all the bright gown guards are going to fight with the army. The local troops and the Association of Demon Kings can't suppress the northern frontier. Besides, Li Zhong stopped abruptly. He waved his hand and said, "Anyway, the northern army can't be mobilized. Within 4 hours, you have to bring me at least 100,000 soldiers. Otherwise, the guards of the royal palace will go out to fight. Even if we can't kill all the border army of the Shunwu dynasty, we have to try our best to wipe them out." As soon as he finished speaking, Li Zhong's face was so gloomy that it was about to drip water. Some words couldn't be heard by a mere guard. The northern frontier wasn't a paradise where everyone was united. There was a lot of blood hidden under the peaceful land. Various factions wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to fight for enough benefits for themselves. Although they had all given up on the position of the actual ruler under Lin Yuan, this did not mean that they were pure of heart and did not care about anything. It was like the aristocratic families that depended on the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce to survive. How could the Qiao family and the Shui family be compared with the other aristocratic families? Although the forces that depended on the northern frontier were controlled by the factions and wouldn't think about being the leader, they would take this opportunity to suppress and scheme against each other because of their irreconcilable hatred. Even if they were punished afterwards, they would still do it. These actions were the same as the forces that rebelled in the Shunwu dynasty. It was just that they didn't have the resources and strength to stand on their own in the northern frontier. They could only drag down the forces of the other factions and try their best to eliminate more forces to increase their own speaking rights. Usually, the northern frontier looked peaceful on the surface. However, at this critical moment, no one could be sure whether they were loyal or not. Li Zhong didn't know who he could trust. He could only let them work together according to their original factions and try his best to avoid infighting. However, there were some ticking time bombs that he had to guard against. For example, Zhong Qilin. The guard had a bitter expression on his face. He could only helplessly accept this task before turning around and leaving the office. He didn't have as many misgivings as Li Zhong. Naturally, he didn't have as many worries as Li Zhong. However, Li Zhong was now their master. Once Li Zhong fell from power, they could forget about having good days in the future. "I really envy you guys. You don't have to think so much." Li Zhong looked at the guard who was gradually walking away and shook his head with a bitter smile. However, a moment later, Li Zhong's face returned to its cold and indifferent expression. However, a trace of madness appeared in his eyes. "Didn't you, Lei Qiusheng, want to play an open scheme with us and turn the area around the imperial capital into a place where anyone who touches you will have to stab their hands with blood? This old man doesn't believe in this evil. While you're organizing a defensive position, this old man will do his best to eliminate the effective forces in your hands and let those Shuangjian barbarian people bleed first. Let's see if you can still sit still on the fishing platform." Li Zhong's strategy wasn't weak. However, he didn't have Lei Qiusheng's boldness. However, this didn't matter. Even a rabbit would bite when cornered. If he couldn't find a way to deal with Lei Qiusheng's open scheme with his own courage, then he might as well give up on his reasoning and use an absolutely bold and crazy strategy. In any case, Lei Qiusheng dared to act as if he was going to drag the northern frontier down with him. How could the northern frontier not dare to accept this? However, on the surface, Lei Qiusheng wanted to drag the northern frontier down with him. However, he still had a trump card in his hands. It didn't matter even if he didn't achieve the desired effect. In any case, Lei Qiusheng was extremely confident that he would still be the ruler of the Shunwu dynasty. He wouldn't become a speck of dust in the long river of history because of a small disturbance. However, Li Zhong's crazy response was just a risky move. To put it bluntly, it was just a bluff. In his heart, he really did have some thoughts of dragging Lei Qiusheng down with him. Chapter 503. But it doesn't matter. After all, I still have the Dragon King behind me. The madness in Li Zhong's eyes gradually subsided. Lei Qiusheng had some unknown trump cards in his hands, but how could Li Zhong not have any trump cards in his hands? The situation had already become so dangerous, But Lin Yuan didn't show any signs of panic. He didn't even have the intention to recall the army in the south back to the northern frontier to fight together. That must be because Lin Yuan still had other cards that he hadn't played yet. Li Zhong knew his position, so he also knew that no matter how much power Lin Yuan gave him, he was still a puppet. And no matter how much a puppet struggled, it was still within the scope of Lin Yuan's ability. As long as Li Zhong wasn't stupid enough to cancel Lin Yuan's original arrangements and order all the troops in the northern frontier to die, then Lin Yuan would still be able to clean up the situation. There was indeed only one ruler in the northern frontier, but Li Zhong, as the king of the northern frontier, still had a lot of power in his hands. In addition, Lin Yuan deliberately molded Li Zhong into a positive figure who always thought for the common people. Anything that was beneficial to the people in the northern frontier would be credited to Li Zhong. The dirty work was basically done by people like Luo Shu, Shedong, and Xia Xiu. This was because Lin Yuan was very clear that the law of the jungle could be absolutely observed in the Hengduan Mountains. But outside the Hengduan Mountains, when dealing with these people, he had to consider everyone's feelings from all aspects. For example, those capable officials who had real talent, hated war, and could really bring benefits to a region would definitely not be willing to serve under a warmonger like Lin Yuan. After all, Lin Yuan's actions were completely different from the ideals they had molded since childhood. Naturally, they wouldn't favor him, but the development of the northern frontier couldn't be done without them. Therefore, Li Zhong appeared. With Li Zhong as the leader, it was a completely different matter. Not just the people on the northern frontier, even the arrogant sages of the Confucian sect mentioned the reforms on the northern frontier. Even though they knew that they were growing on the corpses of the noble families and sects, they did bring benefits to the people. They even removed the opportunity for the noble families and sects as middlemen to suck the wealth of the people. The people received benefits, and so did the income of the rulers. Therefore, no one could go against their conscience and say that the reform of the northern frontier was a strategy to bring chaos to the country. Even though they all knew that the reforms and laws at the northern frontier were all made by Lin Yuan, the exotic beast, they still couldn't believe it. However, since Lin Yuan wanted to give the credit to Li Zhong, these humans agreed to it. They were willing to be blind and not come out to refute. Naturally, there would be talented people who didn't see the twists and turns in the process who came to the northern frontier. Therefore, Li Zhong's position in the northern frontier was very special. Different from the previous two kings of the northern frontier, although Li Zhong didn't have his own faction, his orders carried much more weight than the previous two kings. This was because he was a sign for Lin Yuan to recruit talents. Even if Li Zhong wanted to die, Lin Yuan had to find a way to protect him. "I hope you won't walk on that path of death." Li Zhong placed his hands behind his back and sighed faintly. The situation at the northern frontier was indeed complicated. However, Zhong Qilin and Shenlin Jun, who used to be reserve soldiers, were even more difficult to deal with. These people were 100% loyal to Lei Qiusheng. When Luo Shu was teaching Li Zhongxing, Lin Yuan promoted Zhong Qilin and let him lead those people to build the northern army. Therefore, Li Zhongxing was under the subtle influence. His loyalty to Lei Qiusheng was no longer what it used to be. This time, Lei Qiusheng's action of no building without destruction had greatly impacted Li Zhongxing, who had been nurtured in the northern frontier. Therefore, Li Zhongxing, who was far away in the front line, might not be absolutely loyal to Lin Yuan. However, when it came to protecting the people of the northern frontier, Li Zhongxing would spare no effort to complete it. Therefore, the Great Wall plan would never have any mistakes. However, Zhong Qilin, who had been hanging out with those old brothers, wasn't affected by this. These people still maintained absolute loyalty to Lei Qiusheng. Since Lei Qiusheng could bypass the intelligence agencies of the northern frontier and move the border army to retreat under their noses, then it was impossible for him not to bypass their spies and send the secret edict to Zhong Qilin. At this critical moment, it was better to be stabbed by someone from the inside than to fight against those barbarians of the Shuangjian dynasty. Li Zhongxing stayed in the northern frontier as a prisoner because he wanted to keep an eye on Zhong Qilin and those old subordinates of Li Zhongxing. However, now that Lei Qiusheng had taken such drastic measures, only an idiot would let those border army soldiers leave. However, if he moved, no one could guarantee that Zhong Qilin wouldn't act rashly. Before this, the Northern Frontiers troops were all sent from the Northern Battlefront Army. Of course, it wasn't because the soldiers of the Northern Battlefront Army were strong and had good training. It was because Lin Yuan didn't want Zhong Qilin and those reserve soldiers of Shun Lin Jun to make the Northern Battlefront Army into a private army. That was why he wanted to use this method to scatter those officers of Shun Lin Jun's reserve soldiers into different troops so that they couldn't cooperate with each other. 2 flowers bloomed, one on each side. Let's not talk about the scheming in the northern frontier for now. Li Zhongxing, who was near Donglin City, wasn't having a good time at the moment. Because of the Shunwu dynasty's border army's retreat, the original barrier naturally didn't exist anymore. Although the Shunwu dynasty's army wouldn't go deep into the northern frontiers territory, they wouldn't come near the border and cause trouble near Donglin City, which was heavily guarded. However, even if the Shunwu dynasty's army didn't come, it didn't mean that the Shuangjian dynasty's barbarians were so sensible. As soon as the border army retreated from the fortifications, the barbarians rushed in impatiently. After all, the border army had been ordered to defend the defensive line for the past few days. Not to mention supplies, even the scouts couldn't penetrate the defensive line. Therefore, the 1.2 million Frost Mirror barbarian from before had completely lost contact with them. Now that things had developed to this point, it wasn't just a matter of the missing 13th prince anymore. If the 150,000 Bloodgold Knights were wiped out here, even Frost Mirror Khan wouldn't be able to stop the decline of the Bloodgold tribe, let alone the 13th prince. If the 1.05 million cavalrymen were also lost, who knew how many tribes would be wiped out this winter? Because of this, the chiefs of the Shunwu dynasty's territory were extremely anxious. They repeatedly ordered the northern frontier to release these warriors even if they had to suffer some losses. Therefore, more and more Frost Mirror barbarian rushed into the Shunwu dynasty's territory like wolves and tigers, urgently wanting to get in touch with the vanguard troops. Chapter 504. Previously, Li Zhongxing had used a different strategy to eliminate the vanguard troops, so he could treat them as if they did not exist. But now that the Great Wall plan was halfway through, if he allowed this large wave of barbarians to pass through, the entire plan would become a joke. Moreover, even if these barbarians were not very smart, it was impossible for them to allow the northern territory to build a defensive fortification that could isolate them from their territory. Damn it, let's go all out. Li Zhongxing unsheathed the long sword at his waist and said fiercely, "Don't panic. Craftsman, finish your work in an orderly manner. My men will escort you back to the safety of Donglin City in an orderly manner. Leave 5,000 men to guard the craftsmen. The rest of you, follow me and prepare to fight those barbarians." Almost all of the soldiers following Li Zhongxing were the elites of the southern expedition. Apart from the first batch he had brought out, the rest were all veterans who had participated in the encirclement and suppression of the rebel army in the north. Although the quality of their battle was not up to par, they had still been honed on the battlefield. These soldiers naturally exuded the aura of an invincible army. The Shuangjian barbarian army arrived in an instant, but they did not break through the enemy's formation and charge immediately. Instead, they set up camp 15 li away from Donglin City, seemingly intending to engage in a tug-of-war with Li Zhongxing's headquarters. This was the first time the two sides had met. Even the arrogant Shuangjian barbarian army did not dare to be careless at this moment. After all, the 13th prince, 200,000 Bloodridge cavalrymen, and 450,000 cavalrymen from various tribes had all been lost in the north. Now that the brothers who had invaded the Central Plains had regained contact with them, those who had entered the northern territory were like clay oxen entering the sea. It was as if they had disappeared directly. Given the barbarians' character of bullying the weak and fearing the strong, even if they had not personally experienced the battle with the Northern Frontier Army, they would still realize that the so-called information about the Northern Frontier being weak was all fabricated by the Shunwu dynasty to deceive them. The one who was truly weak was the Shunwu dynasty. However, now that things had developed to this point, the Mirror Frost dynasty did not have the spare energy to cause trouble for the Shunwu dynasty for the time being. After all, their brothers, as well as the 13th prince, whom the Khan had placed all his hopes on, were all trapped in the north. If this matter was not handled properly, the Mirror Frost Khan would be enraged, and countless heads would roll. Both sides had merely set up a battle formation and were facing each other. Unexpectedly, neither side had any intention of taking the initiative to attack. The first day slowly passed by in this kind of stalemate between wanting to say something but hesitating to do so. It was not until noon of the second day that a rider came out of the Shuangjian dynasty's military tent, claiming to be the messenger of the Khan of Frost. Li Zhongsheng's camp was built behind the cement wall. Because the fortification had just begun construction, even with the help of cement, it was impossible to complete it in a short period of time. Moreover, this fortification was only outside Donglin city and had not yet been connected to the planned cities. Naturally, the Shuangjian barbarian did not know that this was the wall of despair that they would encounter in the future. It was just a temporary fortification built by the Northern Frontier Army. The ranger in charge of guarding the place held the so-called messenger on the ground and carefully searched him. After making sure that he did not carry any weapons, he was escorted into the main camp to meet with Li Zhongsheng. After entering the commander's tent, the messenger did not mock Li Zhongsheng with a sneer on his face. Instead, he cupped his fist with a solemn face and said in a deep voice, "I am Qiu Teng, the young chief of the Green Carp tribe in the Frost Mirror grassland. Greetings to all the generals." The moment his voice fell, all the generals in the commander's tent looked at each other in dismay. Then, their eyes fell on Li Zhongsheng's face at the same time. It was said that the Shuangjian barbarian was rude and unreasonable. But now, this messenger had changed his usual behavior. There must be something fishy going on. "I am Li Zhongsheng, the commander of the southern expedition in the northern frontier." Li Zhongsheng sat on the tiger-skin chair, looked down at Qiu Teng and said in a deep voice, "The Shuangjian dynasty started the war without declaring war. First, they attacked our northern frontier territory. Now that the army is here again, the young chief has changed his usual behavior. This is really confusing." Hearing this, Qiu Teng blushed. He cleared his throat and said, "There is something you don't know, Marshal Li. Our Shuangjian dynasty was deceived by a scoundrel. We didn't know that the northern frontier and the Shenwu dynasty had broken off relations. That's why we attacked the northern frontier territory. I'm sure you also know that our Shuangjian dynasty and the Shenwu dynasty have been at war for more than half a year. When we suddenly saw a hole in our border, we naturally wouldn't let go of this opportunity." Qiu Teng's words weren't nonsense. After all, the northern frontier belonged to the Shenwu dynasty. Although the Frost Mirror barbarian clearly came for the northern frontier, they didn't penetrate the northern frontier, let alone enter the territory of the northern frontier. In addition, the Frost Mirror barbarian had come for the Central Plains. So, if they braced themselves and said that they came to attack the Shenwu dynasty, no one could say anything about it. "Oh." Li Zhongsheng suddenly understood and raised his head. He smiled and said, "Young chief means that you attacked the wrong people?" Yes, that's what I meant." Qiu Teng's face was still red, but it wasn't clear whether it was due to excitement or embarrassment. Li Zhongsheng's face suddenly darkened. He said in a strange tone, "Young chief is so sure of this statement. Do you think that I and everyone else are fools? If our northern frontier army entered the Shuangjian dynasty and killed, and then we told you that we were actually going for the demon beasts in the Hengduan mountain range, would you believe us?" As soon as he finished speaking, the generals in the tent suddenly burst into laughter. Qiu Teng's face became even redder. After all, they had all watched the Shuangjian barbarian invade the north. They didn't even look at them, who were disguised as the Shenwu dynasty's troops, and directly rushed to the northern frontier. If the Shuangjian dynasty really came for the Shenwu dynasty, how could they let go of the cities and troops in the north? Donglin city was intact, and they were unharmed. This was a ruthless slap to the Shuangjian dynasty's face. This is not the same. Qiu Teng's face alternated between green and red. He whispered, "Your northern frontier army can directly enter the Hengduan mountain range. Why do you need to use our Frost Mirror grassland?" Li Zhongsheng smiled and shook his head. He mocked, Then why can't your Frost Mirror cavalry gather their forces and directly attack the Central Plains and take over the imperial capital? Why do you have to divide your forces to attack our northern frontier territory? You can divide your forces, but can't we? Qiu Ting's chest rose and fell violently. He stared fiercely at Li Zhongxing, but he couldn't spit out a single word. In terms of sharp tongues, even 100 of him wouldn't be a match for these people. But now, he had to lower his head. Chapter 505. You're being bullied to this extent and you're still not angry? As Li Zhongxing mocked Qu Yang, his eyes flashed with a sharp light as he began to secretly plan. The Shuangjin dynasty hasn't changed much, but they also have experts on their side. They know that Lei Qiusheng wants to use them to clean up the families and sects of the Shunwu dynasty and suppress us at the same time. When the matter is almost done, Lei Qiusheng will make his move. At that time, those Shuangjin barbarian in the south of the Shunwu dynasty won't be able to come out. Therefore, they can only set their sights on the northern frontier, hoping to liberate their forces from our side and ensure that the Shuangjin dynasty won't be greatly damaged by Lei Qiusheng's scheme. After all, after this matter is over, many forces will want a share of the profits. Suddenly, Lin Yuan's voice interrupted Li Zhongxing's contemplation. Li Zhongxing looked around and didn't see any signs of Lin Yuan's existence. He then heard Lin Yuan say, "I'm talking directly to you through my consciousness, so only you can hear my voice. You don't need to find out where I am. Just deal with the matter at hand and try to stall for time. Wait for our people to kill the Frost Mirror barbarian in the northern frontier, but don't deliberately cause a conflict." With Lin Yuan's support, Li Zhongxing's thoughts inexplicably calmed down. Clearing his throat, Li Zhongxing said with a smile, "Young clan leader, you don't need to take it to heart. I'm just complaining. If it were you, young clan leader, you wouldn't easily swallow this resentment after being beaten up for no reason, right? Yes, I don't know what request Commander Li has. Please tell us. The Shuangjin dynasty will do our best to satisfy you." Seeing that Li Zhongxing was giving him a way out, even though Qiu Ting had been humiliated to the point of wanting to die, he had no choice but to pinch his nose and agree. However, this time, Qiu Ting emphasized the words reflection of the Frost dynasty. He wanted to remind Li Zhongxing that he was not alone. There were still millions of reflection of the Frost cavalry outside. If the two sides could not come to an agreement, they would have to fight. If the two of them had a normal conversation, Li Zhongxing might have to think twice before bargaining. However, with Lin Yuan's support, Li Zhongxing no longer had any desire to negotiate. This was because Lin Yuan never intended to give him any face from the beginning. In the end, they would still have to fight. After pondering for a moment, Li Zhongxing's lips curled up slightly. He smiled and said, "Young clan leader, you're too polite. I'm just a commander. Even if I want to negotiate, I'm not qualified. How about this? Young clan leader, go back and rest for 2 days. I'll quickly send a letter to the Northern Frontier Mansion and let the king of the Northern Frontier count the casualties before coming back to talk to young clan leader." Although Qu Yang was smiling, he was cursing in his heart. Of course, he knew that Li Zhongxing's rank wasn't high enough to negotiate with them. However, as one of the 3 commanders of the Northern Frontier, Li Zhongxing's words still carried a certain amount of weight on the Northern Frontier. More importantly, Li Zhongxing and his men were currently at the pass. As long as he didn't agree, his brothers trapped in the north wouldn't be able to come out. They wouldn't even be able to send in supplies. Who knew how many people would die in these 2 days? Licking his lips, Qu Yang asked tentatively, "Commander Li, I came here with sincerity. However, I don't see any sincerity from your side. How about you open a path and let the warriors of the Shuangjin dynasty who mistakenly entered the northern frontier return home?" Almost instantly, Li Zhongxing heard 2 cold snorts. One voice came from Lin Yuan, and the other voice came from a middle-aged scholar in a grey robe in the tent. The middle-aged scholar cupped his fists toward Li Zhongxing, then looked at Qu Yang with a gloomy face and said in a cold voice, "Warriors? Those barbarians may seem like warriors to you, but in the eyes of the northern frontier, they are complete sinners. This young master, Your Shuangjin dynasty wantonly invaded our northern frontier, committing all kinds of crimes. Now that you see that the situation isn't right, you send someone over to say a few words and want us to let them go? Isn't the price of invading our northern frontier a little too low? You are. The corners of Qiu Yang's mouth twitched as he gloomily stared at the middle-aged scholar. After all, Li Zhongsheng's army was blocking the path that they had to pass through. No matter what, he was a mountain that could not be bypassed. The Shuangjin dynasty did not want to waste their military power in such a meaningless place, so they naturally had to say all they could. However, if it was someone else who came to talk to him, he would not be so good-tempered. If it were not for the fact that this middle-aged scholar was Li Zhongsheng's subordinate, he would have already brandished his blade and cut him down. Chen family of Taizong, Chen Zifeng. The middle-aged scholar coldly stared back at Qiu Yang without the slightest hint of panic in his eyes. Chen Zifeng was a traitor on the side of the aristocratic families during the rebellion of the Three Cities. He might not be first-rate in terms of cultivation or strategy, but his insight was unparalleled. From the moment the northern frontier prince's residents began to carry out military orders, he understood one thing. Lin Yuan had no intention of letting go of the Shuangjin dynasty's cavalry that had entered the northern frontier. In other words, Lin Yuan's original intention was to completely fall out with the Shuangjin dynasty. With such a style, either Lin Yuan was not worried about the Shuangjin dynasty's revenge, or he had something that could threaten the Shuangjin dynasty. Coupled with Li Zhongsheng's current attitude, how could Chen Zifeng, who had already seen through everything, not jump out and make his presence known in the eyes of the Dragon King? Never heard of you. But then again, you don't have the right to talk to me. Qiu Yang disdainfully shook his head and sneered, do you think that the Shuangjin dynasty is weak and easy to bully just because I say a few words? Do you really want us to break into this weak camp of yours and hold our swords to your necks before you're willing to talk? The Shuangjin dynasty's soldiers were used to being rude and rude. After Qiu Yang finished speaking, he felt that he had finally vented the anger in his heart. Especially after he finished speaking, the generals in the tent no longer dared to say anything else, especially the more timid ones. At this moment, a thin layer of cold sweat had even seeped out of their foreheads. Seeing this scene, Qiu Yang felt even more confident. After all, not wanting to lose manpower was one thing. The main reason the Shuangjin dynasty's army was willing to stop and negotiate with Li Zhongsheng was because this army was at its peak and had an oppressive aura. Once the two sides started fighting, the Shuangjin dynasty's army might not be able to gain much of an advantage. But now, he realized that although the soldiers below were full of fighting spirit, the generals who made the decision might not have the courage to fight to the death with the Shuangjin dynasty. Clang! Before Qiu Yang could feel smug for long, Li Zhongsheng stood up from his tiger-skin chair and drew his personal guard saber. He walked over to Qiu Yang with a majestic gait, his eyes blooming with killing intent. Since young clan leader has said so, then let's talk after we fight. Chapter 506. As soon as Li Zhongsheng's challenge ended, the generals and strategists in the tent no longer hesitated. They all stared at Qiu Ting like hungry wolves as if he was a piece of juicy pork. Just being stared at by the generals made Qiu Ting break out in a cold sweat. He originally thought that these generals of the southern expedition were unwilling to go to war with the dual sword dynasty. However, after Li Zhongsheng spoke, their sudden change in attitude revealed the problem. They weren't afraid of going to war with the Shuangjin dynasty. Instead, they were worried that the crime of going to war with the Shuangjin dynasty at the northern frontier would fall on their heads. By then, no matter who won or lost, there would be rivers of blood on both sides. Whoever started the war would be the sinner. Now that Li Zhongsheng had taken on the responsibility, they naturally didn't have any scruples. After all, they were all soldiers. Qiu Teng could also understand the attitude of the generals of the southern expedition. If they didn't go to war, how long would they have to endure before they had the chance to be promoted? Marshal Li, you'd better think this through. The Reflection Frost dynasty has come with sincerity. As long as you release our people, we can negotiate any compensation you want. But if you insist on not giving way, we'll carve out a path of blood to bring our brothers home even if we have to kill you. Qiu Ting swallowed his saliva as he sensed the shocking killing intent from Li Zhongxing. His face turned slightly pale. Putting aside the fact that his cultivation wasn't as good as Li Zhongxing's, even if he could defeat Li Zhongxing in a one-on-one fight, there were still the generals of the northern frontier and close to 1 million soldiers of the southern expedition. What was the difference between wanting to kill his way out of this military camp in his unarmed state? Li Zhongxing stopped and rubbed the tip of his nose. He sneered and said, "Haha, it seems like young clan leader is afraid." Nonsense. Qiu Ting's face turned red again. He suppressed his voice and said, "The men of the Shuangjin dynasty aren't afraid of anything. It's just a misunderstanding between us and the northern frontier. Now that we're willing to apologize, why must Marshal Li be so overbearing? Do you think Marshal Li will still have a good reputation if we fight?" Clang. Li Zhongxing flicked the blade in his hand, pointing it straight at Qiu Chen as he fiercely said, "Young patriarch, are you mistaken? Right now, it's the Shuangjin dynasty that's invading the northern frontier. I'm just protecting the country. I didn't send people to invade the Frost Mirror grassland to create friction. The Shuangjin dynasty was the one who started the war. Now, you're the ones asking for peace. Young clan leader can't be so naive as to think that we, the people of the northern frontier, have no temper, right?" As soon as he finished speaking, the entire tent was filled with chaotic shouts of killing. The northern frontier was slightly better, especially the cities near the Central Plains. At the very least, they could be nourished by the Central Plains caravans. However, the living environment of the northern frontier wasn't much better than the Frost Mirror grassland. The only thing that could attract the caravans to bring all kinds of necessities to the northern frontier was a large amount of spiritual items and demon flesh. These were precious materials that were worth tens of thousands of gold taels in rich places. Therefore, if the people of the northern frontier wanted to survive, they had to learn how to identify all kinds of spiritual items from a young age. In the process of harvesting spiritual items, they had to fight demon beasts. Therefore, in terms of bravery and bloodthirstiness, the people of the northern frontier didn't lose to the people of the Frost Mirror grassland. Most of the people following Li Zhongxing were veterans of the southern expedition who had been trained from the northern frontier. The remaining veterans were also the first troops to follow Li Zhongxing. All of them had lived in the extreme north of the Shenwu dynasty. Facing the dangers of survival day after day had never moved these men. Was the Shuangjin dynasty trying to scare them by sending their cavalry in that direction? Hearing the incessant shouts of killing, Qiu Shen felt a buzzing in his head. He didn't know where he got his quick wits from, but he gritted his teeth and roared, "Marshal Li, I have to admit that your troops are brave, but as the marshal, aren't you being a little too reckless? The enemy of the northern frontier isn't the Shuangjin dynasty, but the Shenwu dynasty across the river." Chem. Li Zhongxing slowly raised his right hand. Only then did the shouts of killing stop. Gulp. Qiu Shen swallowed, feeling his throat dry. He continued, "I think, whether it's the king of the northern frontier or the Dragon King, neither of them wants to face the Shuangjin dynasty's troops while fighting the Shenwu dynasty, right? Continue to bicker with him. Drag it out for as long as you can. In any case, none of the people who invade the northern frontier will live." Suddenly, Lin Yuan's voice rang out in Li Zhongxing's mind again. Li Zhongxing's lips curled up slightly. He looked at Qiu Shen with a kind expression and laughed. "Didn't this marshal say that I'm not qualified to speak with the Shuangjin dynasty? This marshal isn't high enough to discuss this matter with the Shuangjin dynasty. If you really want to talk, then let's wait for 2 days and do as His Highness says. Is that all right?" Although Qiu Shen's expression was unsightly, Li Zhongxing was already pointing a blade at him. He naturally knew that he couldn't go too far. Otherwise, this fellow really wouldn't mind fighting with them. After all, the Northern Frontier's current thinking was that they were protecting their country. The responsibility of starting a war didn't even fall on them. But if they fought, the merits would be theirs. This, Qiu Shen nodded with some difficulty and said helplessly, "Everyone, let's both take a step back. Before we reach an agreement, we won't ask you to release our brothers trapped in the northern frontier, but we ask that you provide them with supplies." Phut. Chen Zifang sneered and said to the general next to him, "Hey, Li Zhen, have you ever heard of a burglar breaking into your home and then having to provide him with food and water after holding him down with great difficulty?" "Never heard of it." Like his name, Li Zhen looked burly and powerful, but he had a sharpness that didn't match his appearance. He didn't hesitate to cooperate with Chen Zifang and said with a smile, "In my hometown, when you catch a burglar, you don't even need to send him to the officials. Just beat him to death." Qiushen's expression darkened as he looked at Chen Zifang and Li Zhongsheng. Before he could say "I've tolerated you for a long time," he felt Li Zhongsheng's blade getting closer to his neck. He could only bitterly say, "I know this request is a bit excessive, but those brothers can't just eat and drink, can they? Since Marshal Li also believes that this is a misunderstanding, why should we expand the conflict? If it really doesn't work, we can just send supplies to those brothers inside. Is that not enough?" Li Zhongsheng lightly shook his head and said with a cold face, "Before His Highness's decree, your troops are not allowed to advance an inch. Otherwise, we will treat it as a declaration of war." At this point, Li Zhongsheng glanced at the smiling Chen Zifang. Seeing that the latter was slowly becoming serious, he said in a low voice, "But your troops can give the prepared supplies to me. I will arrange for people to send them to the rear." Qiushen's brows furrowed and he couldn't make up his mind. Chapter 507. In the end, Qiu Teng chose to give in and agreed to send the supplies to the Southern Expedition's camp. However, he also proposed to send some cavalry with good cultivation to transport the supplies. Firstly, he wanted to ensure that these supplies would not be used to support the enemy. Even if the Southern Expedition wanted to take these supplies, they might not be able to kill all the cavalry. If one or two escaped, the two sides might go to war. The consequences were not something Li Zhongsheng could bear. Secondly, he wanted to see for himself the condition of the grassland warriors who had lost contact with the Shuangjin dynasty and see if they were still worth saving. After all, they were now asking for peace with the northern frontier. This was equivalent to exchanging real money for the warriors trapped in the northern frontier. It was similar to the trade of people within the Shuangjin dynasty. The attitude of the northern frontier was obvious. Qiu Teng did not think that the northern frontier's appetite would be small. Even the extremely wealthy Bloodbath tribe would have to fork out a huge sum of money to exchange for the Frost Mirror cavalrymen, not to mention the tribes that the cavalrymen originally belonged to. According to the rules, the tribes that the cavalrymen originally belonged to would have to pay at least 40% of the cost. If this amount of wealth was distributed to the various smaller tribes, it would be an astronomical sum that would suffocate them. Although the Frost Mirror grassland did not lack resources, due to the special living environment, they did not only trade animal meat, spiritual items, and other goods that were widely circulated everywhere. The extra people would also be treated as trade goods. If their own tribe could not afford to raise them, they would be sold to other tribes that had more resources but fewer people. As for their status, it was not a problem that the original tribe had to worry about. As for the remnants of a defeated army, they were clearly not worth the Mirror Frost dynasty's investment. How cruel. The corners of Li Zhongsheng's mouth twitched slightly. His eyes were somewhat hazy. As a future top military officer of the Shunwu dynasty, he naturally knew what Qiu Teng's actions meant. However, this did not mean that he could understand Frost Mirror's barbaric actions. In his opinion, if his fellow soldiers and comrades had fallen into such a situation, he would choose to save those who might still be alive no matter what the price was. He would also try his best to send the bodies of the dead back to their hometown for a proper burial. Unlike Frost Mirror Man, who regarded his compatriots as a resource and only traded with them when he could gain benefits from it, Frost Mirror Man did. If they were in the same predicament one day, would they be disgusted by their fellow soldiers' actions? After Qiu Teng left the camp, Li Zhongsheng waved his hand and dismissed all the generals and staff officers in the commander's tent. In order to prevent a troop from becoming the personal army of the commander, Li Zhong carefully divided each troop into different battalions. Every 10,000 men could form a battalion, and each battalion had a battalion commander, a deputy commander, and 3 staff officers. Including the mid-level and low-level officers, any battalion of the three armies of the northern frontier could almost snowball into a huge army without falling into chaos. Although the battalion commanders and deputy battalions were all outstanding graduates of the military school of the Northern Frontier Academy, their backgrounds were completely different. Some were grassroots generals promoted by Lin Yuan from poor families, while others were descendants of aristocratic families who had submitted to Lin Yuan. As for the staff officers, one was from the Demon Emperor Association, while the other two were guests of Li Zhongxing and Qianhu of the Genie Guards. It could be said that each faction was stuffed into a battalion to check and balance each other. No matter what the characters and abilities of these people were, they all had their own factions behind them. Naturally, it was impossible for them to get along well. After all, everyone had their own interests. Only very few people would believe in feelings and loyalty. Of course, in order to prevent each faction from harming their comrades for their own interests, Li Zhongxing also adopted a system of punishment. For example, once disobeying orders, the battalion commander, deputy battalion commander, and 3 staff officers would not be able to escape. It was fine if it was impossible, but if anyone was determined to drag down the northern frontier, before facing the anger of Lin Yuan and Li Zhongxing, they would still have to wrestle with the other 4 big shots. Unless all 5 of them were determined to betray the northern frontier, just the difference in strength alone was enough to send those disloyal fellows to hell. It was also because of this system of appointment that although Li Zhongxing was nominally the commander of the southern expedition and could mobilize any unit, he could only give a general strategy and detailed battle objectives. The degree of completion and the plan of completion were all discussed by his subordinates. If Qu Ting had not come to the meeting as an emissary of the Shuangjian dynasty, the northern frontier generals and staff officers would never have gathered in Li Zhongxing's tent. Now that the meeting was over, even if Li Zhongxing did not ask them to leave, they would not stay here for long. After all, no one knew when the war would start. If they had the time to chat here, they might as well go back and sharpen their weapons. Dragon King, I'm not doubting you, but I feel that your way of doing things is no different from playing with fire. After everyone had left, Li Zhongxing casually threw his saber to the side and sat down on his tiger-skinned chair. He said in a deep voice, "Since you don't intend to negotiate with these barbarians, you shouldn't keep them in suspense. Now that things have come to this, it's really not easy to end things." Lin Yuan's projection slowly condensed in Li Zhongxing's commander's tent. A cold glint flashed in his different-colored eyes as he sneered, "I want to use the fate of these barbarians to tell everyone that no matter what schemes they have behind the scenes, if they don't have the determination to fight to the death with the northern frontier, don't interfere. Otherwise, this king will directly chop off their hands. Do you think it's better to settle things once and for all, or to drag things out slowly?" At this point, Lin Yuan paused for a moment and said, "The Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce has indeed brought in a lot of profits. Before this, it could almost support the simultaneous operation of several projects. But after the war started, 2/3 of the reform and construction projects in the northern frontier were suspended, and all the money squeezed out was used to fund the various troops. Because of this, the various departments still owe the soldiers their salaries. Although the equipment from the Ministry of Works and the Ministry of War has been equipped with all of you, they have only paid you a portion of the cost of the materials. They still haven't paid you the labor fees and salaries." A string of black lines slowly appeared on Li Zhongxing's forehead. Of course, he knew that war cost money, and a lot of it at that. For example, the Shunwu dynasty had been peaceful for decades. Even if the officials were greedy, the treasury was still considered rich. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Lei Qiusheng slept on a mountain of gold every day. But how long had it been since the war on 4 fronts started? The treasury of the Shunwu dynasty had basically been emptied. Chapter 508. After all, you're a general now. You can't think in such a simple way. Theoretically, I should only pay you the salary of the South Expedition Army. Actually, you should be concerned about the expenses and rations of the surrendered troops and captives. However, I still paid the bill for you. As of now, your South Expedition Army is growing larger and larger in scale. Did I tell you to stop? Lin Yuan sat up and said calmly, anyway, I don't want to fight the Shunwu dynasty and the Shuangjin dynasty slowly. If you want to let these people go, you will have to fight at the front when the Frost Mirror Barbarian invades next time. Also, don't expect me to pay you a single cent outside of the establishment. The corner of Li Zhongxing's mouth twitched slightly. He held back the swear words that were about to come out of his mouth. He didn't have the national treasury of the Shunwu dynasty that had been peaceful for decades, nor did he have the terrifying beast that was the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce. If he had to support an army of millions of people, wouldn't that be asking for his life? But Lin Yuan's attitude was very clear. He didn't want to fight this war. Whoever wanted to fight would pay. Li Zhongxing wanted to complain about this kind of rascal behavior, but he didn't know how to say it. After all, the Southern Expedition's military strength was several times greater than the establishment that Lin Yuan had given him. And as the work of cleaning up the Northern Territory continued, this number was still increasing. When the war was over, they would definitely be dealt with. But Li Zhongxing didn't want to be forced into a dead end because of this matter. Then if all 500,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian soldiers are lost at the northern frontier, how should we deal with it? Now that the Shuangjin dynasty has taken the initiative to beg for peace with us, it seems that they are prepared to bleed a lot. But not only did the Dragon King not give them face, his actions are no different from starting a war. If they really go to war regardless of everything, it will be no less than a disaster for our northern frontier. Li Zhongxing cupped his fist at Lin Yuan and said in a deep voice, "Am I right?" Li Zhongxing, who was disgusted by Lei Qiuxing's action of abandoning the people in the Northern Territory, couldn't tolerate sand in his eyes now, especially after experiencing the good life of the people in the northern frontier. Li Zhongxing couldn't be said to be loyal to anyone now. The only thing he wanted to protect was the people in the northern frontier who had sacrificed everything for their livelihood. Lin Yuan said that he wasn't willing to go to war with the Shuangjin dynasty, but at the same time, he was provoking the Shuangjin dynasty. He couldn't figure out the meaning behind this at all, so he could only look at Lin Yuan with a confused gaze, hoping to get an answer. If Lin Yuan really decided to go to war with the Shuangjin dynasty at the critical juncture where the Shunwu dynasty was about to launch a counterattack against the northern frontier, then Li Zhongxing would summon those loyal to him to launch a military remonstrance even if it meant risking his life, forcing Lin Yuan to give up this bold idea that shouldn't have existed. The northern frontier alone was enough for them to digest for a long time. Not to mention that Lei Qiuxing still had the strength to spare. Even if he could kill Lei Qiuxing in one blow, the northern frontier wouldn't be able to take down the remaining Central Plains and Southern Territory. So Li Zhongxing is right. You still have room for improvement in strategy, but in terms of strategy, you're just a chicken. Lin Yuan looked at Li Zhongxing with pity, helplessly shaking his head, and explained, "Right now, we're not the ones fighting a war. I'd rather use these military funds to develop the northern frontier and even the entire northern territory than waste them on such meaningless things. You're also one of the people with the highest status in the northern frontier. You should know how much work we still have to do and how much resources we lack." Hearing this, although Li Zhongxing didn't like the way Lin Yuan looked at him like he was an idiot, he still nodded to show his agreement. If Lin Yuan really was a warmonger, he wouldn't waste time researching the new laws of the northern frontier. He also wouldn't exterminate the sects and then punish the noble families. He also wouldn't take all the land in the northern frontier and rent it to the people for farming at a very low price. At the same time, he would establish the Northern Frontier Academy and a series of huge projects related to people's livelihood, medical care, and other fields. Just by relying on the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce, it wasn't impossible for Lin Yuan to cultivate the northern frontier into a war-loving land where everyone was a soldier. However, Lin Yuan's choice was to slowly develop and gradually reform. Every move might not be beneficial at the moment, but it would definitely be beneficial for the future. If there were really so many resources that he didn't have any place to use them, Lin Yuan would definitely carry out more projects and build more gathering places so that every inch of land in the northern frontier could be used properly. He wouldn't train an army to compete with the Shunwu dynasty. Although it looked like Lin Yuan made the first move, in reality, Lin Yuan's purge of the northern frontier was Lei Qiusheng's idea. The situation had developed to this point because Lei Qiusheng didn't want Lin Yuan to easily take over the northern frontier. It would be best if he acted like a tool and wiped out the rebellion in the northern frontier. After forcing the southern frontier to make a move, he would obediently retreat to his own northern frontier. However, Lei Qiusheng wasn't the only tyrannical person in this world. Lin Yuan, who was able to come up with God's mandate and king's law, was no less tyrannical than Lei Qiusheng. However, Lei Qiusheng didn't have the boldness to lie by the side of the bed and allow others to sleep soundly. From the beginning, he only wanted to use the northern frontier as a test subject for the reform, so that the hostility of those aristocratic families and sects would be transferred to us. However, now that the northern frontier is strong, Lei Qiusheng can no longer let us continue to grow. Once we take over the northern frontier, the speed of our development will definitely rise to another level. At that time, the extremely weak Shenwu dynasty might not be able to be destroyed at any moment, but the outcome would already be determined. Therefore, the battle between the Shenwu dynasty and the northern frontier will happen sooner or later. It's just a matter of waiting for us to be fully prepared before attacking, or Lei Qiusheng taking advantage of the fact that we haven't stabilized our footing yet. For an outstanding military strategist like me, Lei Qiusheng's actions weren't out of my expectations. On the contrary, I didn't expect the Shenwu dynasty to be so weak. Therefore, I'm more and more worried about what kind of trump card he has in his hand. Under these circumstances, our own wishes don't matter at all. Right now, the Reflection Frost dynasty has changed their ways and is humbly begging for peace with us. It's not because of the reasons they've given us, but simply because they don't want to fight. Therefore, whether we teach them a lesson or not, they won't fight. Or rather, they won't choose to fight to the death with us right now. Do you think they will be grateful to us if we let those barbarians go? Lin Yuan's eyes flickered with an obscure brilliance. It was as if he was looking at the Frost Mirror Khan from countless miles away and seeing through his heart. His tone was even more certain than guessing. Chapter 509. Isn't that the case? Li Zhongsheng's eyes widened. If all 500,000 Frost Mirror cavalrymen are killed, it'll be a blood feud. Those barbarians will never let it go. They'll have to go to war eventually. Your actions will definitely bring the war forward. Li Zhongsheng felt that the more he listened, the more confused he became. It seemed that Lin Yuan was right, but his reason told him that this was all sophistry. Lin Yuan definitely had other plans behind his back. After such a huge feud, even if Frost Mirror Khan didn't want to go to war with Lin Yuan, those tribes would definitely force him to send troops to the northern frontier. After all, only some of them were unlucky now. Once the war started, the northern frontier and the whole Shuangjian dynasty would be in trouble. Even if it was for the survival of their own tribes, most of them would choose to go to war. Frost Mirror Khan is like a wolf. Before they're full, they'll keep following you. When you show a weakness, they'll pounce on you and tear your flesh apart to fill their stomach. If you don't want to, you can only raise your weapons and beat them until they're scared. Only then will they tuck their tails between their legs and show their more dog-like side. They'll stay away from you and won't dare to provoke you for a while. If we show weakness now, the Shuangjian dynasty won't be grateful to us. Instead, they'll think that the northern frontier is only strong on the outside but weak on the inside. After they've healed their wounds, the first thing they'll do is to invade our territory and burn, kill, and pillage. By then, it'll be an endless war. Mirror Frost had fallen into Lei Qiusheng's trap. Not only were the 700,000 Mirror Frost cavalrymen trapped in the Central Plains unable to come out, even more Mirror Frost cavalrymen would be trapped in this deadly trap. Based on this battle alone, I am certain that at least half of the Shuangjian dynasty's border army near the Shenwu dynasty will be destroyed. Apart from the border army, the tribes near the Shenwu dynasty will also lose many young and strong men. Of course, we weren't the only ones who knew that Lei Qiusheng's concession was a trap. The Shuangjian dynasty knew it too. The reason they wanted to make peace with us was to preserve their strength as much as possible so that they wouldn't lose too much of their strength. They might even lose the edge of the frost mirror grassland so that their ranch could become our hunting ground. If both sides worked together and the beast tied in the Hungduan mountain range, the Shuangjin dynasty might not even be able to recover from the setback. Speaking of which, if we can't determine the victor between us and Lei Qiusheng, then we need a way out. Therefore, the Shuangjin dynasty's invasion this time is a way for us to ease our relationship. At that time, we can choose to call a truce and head north together to collect this debt of blood from the Shuangjin dynasty. Then, we can return to our respective territories and start accumulating strength for the next war. But this time, if we sign a truce, we won't have an excuse to head north to attack the Frost Mirror grassland. Naturally, we can't join forces to attack the Shuangjin dynasty. Even if we shamelessly call a truce, the other dynasties won't just stand by and watch us attack the Shuangjin dynasty. If they cut off the trade with the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce, we won't even have a place to cry. So, they only need to withstand the pressure from Lei Qiusheng. Lin Yuan narrowed his eyes slightly and smiled. I don't want the northern frontier to fall into a two-sided war. I just want to tell these barbarians one thing. The northern frontier will never back down from a fight. As long as they want to fight, I'll fight with them. Plus, there's a special tribal system there. Before we can catch our breath, Shuangjin Khan's throne will probably change hands. Do you think that Shuangjin Khan, who has dominated the grassland for 50 years, will do such a profitable business for a bunch of dead people? This, Li Zhongsheng's eyes widened even more. He said with a puzzled expression, since the Shuangjin dynasty has already seen through the trap, won't they know to withdraw and wait for the right opportunity? They'll attack us when we fight with Lei Qiusheng. No matter who they help, or whether they fight on both sides, they'll still benefit from it. That's what we need to do. Fan the flames, add oil, let this fire burn even more fiercely. Let the Shuangjin dynasty suffer the greatest loss and force them to swallow their anger. The coldness in Lin Yuan's eyes slowly faded and turned into an obscure emotion. I'm slow-witted. I don't understand what the Dragon King means. Li Zhongsheng shook his head with a bitter smile. However, he was sharp enough to smell the blood in Lin Yuan's words. In the end, weren't they still going to fight? Sophistry indeed. The loss of 500,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian is not an unacceptable loss for the Shuangjin dynasty, because the number of young men who die from the cold, starvation, or being killed by demon beasts on the grassland is far more than that. However, for some tribes, the loss of these young men is a disaster. They won't accept this result easily, so they'll do everything they can to recoup their losses. For example, 500,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian died on the northern frontier, but 700,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian killed and looted as they pleased in the Central Plains. If they want to recoup their losses, do you think it's better to start a war with the northern frontier, or go to the Central Plains, where they think it's incomparably prosperous, and even plunder for a while more in the south? If we show enough strength, the Shuangjin barbarian will wisely choose to avoid us and hold this grudge in their hearts for the time being. However, in the current situation, their first choice is still to plunder the Shunwu dynasty. This wise decision is what both Lei Qiusheng and I want to see. The only ones who want to stop them are the higher-ups of the Shuangjin dynasty. However, the tribes that have suffered losses won't let go of such a good opportunity, especially the small and medium-sized tribes outside the range of Frost Mirror Khan's influence. Even if they pretend to be obedient, they won't let go of such a fat piece of meat like the Shunwu dynasty. Lin Yuan's voice trembled as he said, Lei Qiusheng used the bones of countless people to build a path to victory for himself. In this aspect, he's even more of a bloodthirsty demon beast than this king. But you also said that the Shuangjin dynasty already knows that this is a trap. Before Li Zhongsheng could finish his words, his face turned pale and he swallowed dryly. He suddenly realized that Lin Yuan, this demon beast, knew more about the situation of the various factions than he, a professionally trained officer, did. The unique tribal system of the Shuangjin dynasty was no different from that of the demon beasts in the Hungduan mountain range. However, the beast Lord Kirin could intimidate countless demon beasts, but the old Frost Mirror Khan didn't have such strength. Although he was revered as the king of the grassland, The small and medium-sized tribes outside the range of the Bloodliao tribe's influence had never obeyed Frost Mirror Khan's orders. Chapter 510. The harvest of 700,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian in the Central Plains was enough to make most of the Frost Mirror tribes jealous. It was also enough to drive the tribes that had suffered heavy losses crazy. Even if the Frost Mirror Khan ordered them not to enter the Shunwu dynasty's territory, they wouldn't listen. Lin Yuan's act of killing 500,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian was equivalent to pouring oil on Lei Qiusheng's trap. The fire that wasn't strong enough to begin with instantly engulfed more than half of the Frost Mirror grassland. And this was an overt scheme. Unless the Shuangjin dynasty was willing to start an all-out war with the northern frontier, they could only choose the seemingly weak Shunwu dynasty. This king isn't as ruthless as Lei Qiusheng, but this king loves his own people more than Lei Qiusheng. Lin Yuan finally regained his composure and said with a smile, "No one knows what Lei Qiusheng's trump card is. This king doesn't want him to use it on the northern frontier. It's better to send him more Frost Mirror Barbarian. When he can't hold on anymore, he'll naturally reveal his trump card in advance. I know what to do." Li Zhongxing nodded with a serious expression. No one knew what Lei Qiusheng's trump card was, but in this situation, unless Lei Qiusheng went crazy, he definitely had something that could change the situation in an instant. Letting Lei Qiusheng use this thing on the Shuangjin barbarian was obviously much better than using it on the northern frontier. Although he didn't like this kind of scheme, it wasn't his own doing. However, this wasn't his doing, and it was indeed for the sake of the entire northern region. Therefore, even if Li Zhongxing didn't like it, he could only persuade himself to accept and even obey. The next morning, Qu Yang led 30 Shueliao cavalry and 200+ carriages of supplies, his face solemn as he arrived at the Southern Expedition's scouting area. After yesterday's meeting, Li Zhongxing had no intention of stopping him. Very quickly, he led the 5,000 light cavalry to the front of the formation. Marshal Li looks a lot more energetic. Qu Fan rubbed her hands together. She had dark circles under her eyes, and it was obvious that she hadn't rested well. In fact, Li Zhongxing had also gone through a lot of mental struggles last night. But after thinking it over, she still decided that Lin Yuan's actions were the most beneficial for the northern frontier. It was also the best way to break Lei Qiusheng's trap. At the very least, it was the method with the least losses. So, for the latter half of the night, Li Zhongxing didn't continue to brainstorm with herself and fell asleep peacefully. But looking at Qu Yang's appearance, Lei Qiusheng knew that this young clan leader of the Green Fish tribe didn't have a good time after returning home yesterday. The arrogant and unreasonable Shuangjin dynasty had lowered their proud heads, but they didn't get the respect they deserved from the northern frontier. The situation they were facing was completely different from what they had expected. Not only did the northern frontier not show the slightest bit of fear, they even seemed to be full of fighting spirit. But even if the northern frontier wanted to fight, the Shuangjin dynasty didn't. They only wanted to preserve their strength and wait until the northern frontier and the Shunwu dynasty had a decisive battle before coming to take advantage of the situation. There was no need for them to help that bastard Lei Qiusheng fight the vanguard after falling into his trap. At least, that was what the generals of the Shuangjin dynasty convinced themselves. But according to Qu Yang's report, the northern frontier didn't plan to release the captives immediately. They wanted to send the message back and wait for the reply from the northern frontier prince's mansion before deciding on their next move. Before that, they couldn't even send their supply wagons past the southern expedition's position. They could only send some cavalry to accompany the southern expedition to transport the wagons. In the words of those scholars, the behavior of the northern frontier was no different from being shameless when they were given face. But they couldn't do anything because, just as Lin Yuan had predicted, the Shuangjin dynasty didn't plan to fight this battle. So, they could only vent their anger on Qu Yang, the envoy. As a result, Qu Yang looked like he was going to collapse at any moment. Li Zhongxing glanced at Qu Yang and said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I didn't expect young clan leader to be so knowledgeable about the situation of our brothers trapped in the northern frontier. 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers wasn't a small number." These 200 wagons of supplies were only enough to fill the gaps between their teeth. Although the defense line of the northern frontier wasn't that tight, the intelligence network formed by the association of the Demon Emperor's members and the embroidered uniform guards wasn't something that the Shuangjin dynasty could infiltrate. So, the Shuangjin barbarian soldiers who were still defending the plains definitely hadn't made contact with the main forces. So, Qu Yang's 200 wagons of supplies were just a pretense. At the same time, it was also to express his distrust of the northern frontier. Qu Yang smiled helplessly and wiped the sweat on his forehead. He said with an apologetic smile, "Marshal Li must be joking. Just by looking at your southern expedition, I know that the northern frontiers army isn't ordinary. We know our own strength. How could those good-for-nothings be a match for your northern frontiers army? Let alone 500,000, even if they had 200,000 left, they would be burning incense to thank the gods." At this point, Quzhua paused for a moment before continuing, "We're just going to take a look at the situation today. Although the supplies we brought are better than nothing, they should be able to last for half a day. Once we confirm the situation, we'll be able to make preparations." Li Zhongxing expressionlessly pulled on the reins and turned his horse around. He said coldly, "I'll say the ugly words first. Your cavalry had better behave themselves. If they do anything inappropriate, I have the right to kill them on the spot. Also, after confirming the situation, you can prepare for the next shipment, but all of your cavalry will have to come back with you. Do you understand this?" "Understand my ass." Qu Yang's face suddenly darkened. He didn't expect Li Zhongxing's slap to come so quickly and so suddenly. They had prepared such a small amount of supplies in order to annoy Li Zhongxing and make his men make a few more trips. Of course, there was no lack of distrust in Li Zhongxing. They were worried that the southern expedition would seize too much of the supplies, which would be considered an act of aiding the enemy. But Li Zhongxing's attitude was also very clear: "You don't trust me, and I don't trust you. You think I'll seize your supplies? I think you're using this method to increase your troops." But then again, both sides were just trying to annoy each other. They didn't really suspect each other of doing anything. After all, the supplies were only enough to fill the gaps between Li Zhongxing's teeth. Even if Li Zhongxing seized them, they would only be able to fill the gaps between their teeth. With the troops around him, they could eat all 200 carriages of supplies in 1 or 2 meals. Although the dozens of cavalry were all in the late stage of the airborne realm, such a small number of people was definitely not enough to increase the number of troops. What was the difference between increasing the number of troops in such a scale and sending them to their deaths? Chapter 511. Marshal, what should we do with the Frost Mirror cavalry that came with us? A light rider rode up to Li Zhongxing, a faint murderous intent flashing across his fair face. The fair-skinned young general was a graduate of Qiao Yu's batch. However, unlike Qiao Yu, who was known as Black Bear due to his simple and honest nature, Qiao Yu was known as the Black Bear, which made him the type of general who would charge and break through enemy lines. On the other hand, the fair-skinned young general, Zhong Xiuzhu, was more of a scholarly general. His training was decent as well, having reached the pinnacle of the airborne realm before the age of 30. He was only one step away from reaching the celestial star realm. Li Zhongxing was also one of the military mentors of the Northern Frontier Academy. Qiao Yu and Zhong Xiuzhu were both students that he thought highly of. Although they had their own shortcomings and were not as good as Qin Yu and Zhao Guangchong, who were taught by Lin Yuan and were able to lead troops to the south as soon as they graduated, he still wanted to get closer to Li Zhongxing. To be fair, Zhong Xiuzhu was not worse than the students taught by Lin Yuan. He could become a famous general after some training. However, his biggest weakness was hatred. Zhong Xiuzhu's parents were both civilians. They did not even have the ability to move to other places to live, let alone have the ability to cultivate. Therefore, every year when the Frost Mirror Barbarian raided the border, Zhong Xiuzhu and his parents could only rely on luck to avoid being killed. However, luck would always run out. When Zhong Xiuzhu was 7 years old, the Shuangjin dynasty raided the border. His parents were killed by the sword, and only the young Zhong Xiuzhu escaped by hiding in a secret cellar at home. Since then, the seed of hatred had been planted in Zhong Xiuzhu's heart. Lin Yuan set up the Northern Frontier Academy and supported poor students. This was a great opportunity for Zhong Xiuzhu, and he did show his extraordinary talent. Compared to the children of aristocratic families who grew up with spiritual objects, Zhong Xiuzhu, who started cultivating in his 20s, could not achieve much. However, there was no limit to human perseverance and potential. Zhong Xiuzhu, who had a blood feud, was far more hardworking than the other students in the same batch. His cultivation, the art of war, and even strategy were all excellent in almost every subject. However, when everyone thought that Zhong Xiuzhu could win Lin Yuan's favor and become the most dazzling star of the northern frontier in the future, this guy rejected Lin Yuan's olive branch without hesitation and went straight to the main camp of the southern expedition. From Zhong Xiuzhu's point of view, it was impossible for the Southern Expedition Army to continue south in a short period of time. However, the cleanup work in the north still had to continue. Apart from those clans that were still stubbornly resisting, the Frost Mirror barbarian cavalry that pillaged the border would be the Southern Expedition Army's main opponent for a very long time, and Zhong Xiuzhu was indeed capable. After a series of tests, Li Zhongxing believed that this guy, who was not much younger than him, would become the most dazzling star of the northern frontier in the future, even if he rejected the recruitment of the so-called Star General class. Therefore, even though he knew that Zhong Xiuzhu was currently on the southern expedition, he would divide the southern expedition in the future and take part of the people to form a new army to wrestle with the Shuangjian barbarian. Li Zhongxing gladly accepted Zhong Xiuzhu as his disciple and even trained him as his successor. However, Zhong Xiuzhu's performance in the past 2 months had indeed proved that he deserved Li Zhongxing's favor. In response to this proud disciple's question, Li Zhongxing only raised his eyelids and said through secret voice sending, "The Shuangjian dynasty has 35 cavalry with them this time. Apart from the heavy military supplies we have, you can only take 50 people with you. How do you think we should deal with them? Kill them." A cold light bloomed in Zhong Xiuzhu's eyes as he replied without hesitation. Li Zhongxing was silent for a while. Zhong Xiuzhu scratched the back of his head and said with a smile, "Marshal is not a person who makes arbitrary decisions, but with your authority, it's not impossible for you to let the Shuangjian barbarian go. However, you chose to stall for time without discussing with us. This action already shows that Marshal has no intention of letting those barbarians go. Moreover, you're not the only one who has an opinion on this matter." "Ha ha." Li Zhongxing smiled non-committally. He just waved his horsewhip gently, indicating for Zhong Xiuzhu to leave. Just as Lin Yuan had said, Li Zhongxing was a chicken when it came to strategy. His current actions could only deceive the Shuangjian barbarian. However, those in the southern expedition with discerning eyes could see that Li Zhongxing, who had always followed the advice of others, had chosen to use stalling tactics to cut off the Frost Mirror barbarian's chances of survival. It was obvious that someone was guiding him behind the scenes. And although Li Zhongxing was the king of the northern frontier, he only had the authority to make suggestions. He did not have the authority to directly command the commander-in-chief of the northern frontier's 3 armies. If it was Li Zhongxing's idea, then Li Zhongxing would still have to discuss it with them before deciding whether to do it or not. That was why the entire southern expedition was so quiet. No one argued with Li Zhongxing like Li Zhongxing did with Lin Yuan. The reason was very simple. Most of them were already scared out of their wits by Lin Yuan. Lin Yuan had never tasted defeat since his debut. Therefore, they could not see the depth of Lin Yuan's decision. Even if they could see it clearly, no one would overestimate themselves and ask Lin Yuan to correct it. When Zhong Xiuzhu gradually rode away, Li Zhongxing once again said through secret sound transmission, "Just say that it was my idea. Go to that place and pick a group of ruthless people to go with you. First, lead them around in circles. After you have shed all pretense of cordiality, you must do it cleanly. Don't leave any hidden dangers." Speaking up to here, Li Zhongxing paused and smiled. Besides that, Wei River City has been breached, and there are still over 100,000 reserve troops of the Divine Forest Army gathered near Kangdao City. We can't clear them out for the time being, But we have to let these frost mirror barbarians vent their anger, right? This general will not disappoint the Grand Marshal. Zhong Xiuzhu pulled on the reins and turned his head to look at Li Zhongsheng. His white face squeezed out a bright smile. As for how to use these 200 carriages of supplies to provoke the conflict between the Frost Mirror Barbarian and the Shunlin Jun reserves, he had already outlined a rough plan in his mind. At the same time, he also guessed what Black Jiao, who gave him today's position and opportunity, was planning. Qiu Ting stared blankly at the two people's lips moving. He subconsciously felt his heart sink. But when he listened carefully, he could not understand what they were talking about. Although they were speaking the common language of Qianwu continent, the words they spat out were all numbers. For someone like him who did not know the code of the northern frontier, it was no different from listening to a heavenly book. But his keen sense of danger still made him feel that the southern expedition was secretly planning something. Chapter 512. Young clan leader, why are you in a daze? Li Zhongsheng urged his horse to the side of the hesitant Qiu Teng and lightly poked him with the end of his whip. Only then did Qiu Teng wake up from his deep thoughts. His entire body seemed to have been startled, and cold sweat began to appear on his forehead. That was my favorite student, but his personality is a little weird. He doesn't know how to speak the common language of the Sky Marshal continent, so we were using a special secret signal to communicate. I told him to go back and pick 50 capable brothers to escort you on this trip. Is there any problem on your side? Qiu Teng finally calmed down. When he looked at Li Zhongsheng again, he discovered that he was smiling warmly. Gently shaking his head, Qiu Teng forced himself to calm down and said, "But I heard that the northern frontier isn't very peaceful right now. Can 50 people really escort the supplies safely to the destination? Why don't we discuss it again and have both sides send more people?" When he heard the number 50 people, the stone in Qiu Teng's heart slowly fell. After all, the cavalry of the northern frontier couldn't be compared to the cavalry of the Shuangjian dynasty. Even the horses they rode were inferior war horses bought from the Shuangjian dynasty. Even if their cultivation was higher, 50 people against 35 people might not have more than a 50% chance of victory. And even if they could defeat them, it was impossible to keep all 35 of them at the northern frontier. As long as one or two escaped, the northern frontier wouldn't be able to take it. Even Qiu Teng, who had always believed in his intuition, felt that he was being too cautious, and even a little oversensitive. Li Zhongsheng lightly shook his head and bitterly smiled. To be honest, although there are many hidden dangers in the northern frontier, the real threat is the Frost Mirror Cavalry and Shunlin Jun's reservists that we couldn't completely eliminate. With your people here, even if we bump into the Frost Mirror Cavalry, they won't do anything. And if we encounter those reservists, even 2,000 people won't be able to do anything. But if the number of people is smaller, the target will naturally be smaller, and it will be much safer. Qiu Teng stared blankly at Li Zhongsheng. Shunlin Jun was the trump card of the Shunwu dynasty, and was also the trump card of Lei Qiusheng's dragon throne. Even the reservists were quite a formidable existence. Furthermore, Wei River City, which was known as the Impregnable Fortress, was also a famous existence. But now, the reserve force of the Divine Forest Army had been defeated and even Wei River City had been breached. What kind of monsters were these people? Thinking of this, Qiu Teng's last trace of hostility towards the northern frontier completely dissipated. He bitterly smiled and said, "If that's the case, then we'll do as the Grand Marshal wishes. I'll go inform them to prepare to depart." Although the men of the Shuangjian dynasty didn't lack courage and bravery, the special living environment still made them have the personalities of wolves and dogs. Just as Lin Yuan predicted, the stronger the northern frontier displayed, the more the Shuangjian dynasty didn't want to provoke the northern frontier. But Qiu Teng, who was just about to leave, suddenly remembered something. He abruptly pulled on the reins and said, "Our 13th prince was deceived by the Shunwu dynasty some time ago and led his troops into the northern frontiers territory by mistake. It's been almost half a month since then. I wonder if our 13th prince is a guest at your residence." Although the third prince speculated that the 13th prince was dead, the proud Shuang Jianren didn't think so. In their eyes, the northern frontier was just a group of nouveau riche. They might not even be able to withstand the counterattack of the Shunwu dynasty. How could they offend the Shuangjin dynasty at this time? Therefore, even if the 13th prince went on a killing spree in the northern frontier, he only needed to announce his identity after he was defeated. Not only would the northern frontier not dare to touch him, they would even treat him as a guest of honor and wait for the Shuangjin dynasty to take him away. Young master, you must be joking. I haven't heard any news about the 13th prince. The warm smile on Li Zhongsheng's face instantly disappeared. He said coldly, I will write another letter to ask the northern frontiers residents. However, I advise you not to have any delusions about this matter. You know our Dragon King's personality. The Shuangjin dynasty has sent troops to invade the northern frontier one after another. If they don't pay a price, they will lose face. This, Qiu Teng originally thought that taking the 13th prince out was just a matter of convenience. After all, they could let the 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarians go. If they let a few more people go, they wouldn't be criticized. However, Li Zhongsheng's cold attitude was telling him to stop dreaming. The Shuangjin dynasty would definitely pay a price for these two invasions. Between the 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarian and the 13th prince, he could only choose one. I still have military matters to attend to. Farewell. Without waiting for Qiu Yang to quibble, Li Zhongsheng cupped his fists and urged his horse to rush towards the army camp. His trying to sow discord. When Li Zhongsheng disappeared from sight, Qiu Teng threw the horsewhip in his hand to the ground. Between the 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarians and the 13th prince, this was a choice that even a child could make. However, when it came to Qiu Teng, he couldn't make up his mind. Not to mention that among the 500,000 cavalrymen trapped in the north, at least 60,000 of them were Green Fish Clan's disciples. The other clans who had lost some of their men were all hoping that their men could return safely. Because of this matter, Qiu Teng, the envoy, was treated with great respect. Gifts that Qiu Teng didn't even dare to think about before were prepared and sent directly to his tent. There were even some tribes that used beauty traps. Their goal was to make Qiu Teng protect as many of their tribesmen as possible. Once Juki gave up on the 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarian cavalrymen and chose to bring the 13th prince back to the imperial court, he would be tied to the Blood Liao tribe. Once the Blood Liao tribe collapsed, there would be no place for the Green Fish tribe to stay in the prairie. If Khan Shuang had been young, it would have been fine. Unfortunately, Khan Shuang had been seriously injured when he was young. His cultivation had not improved in the past few years, and his body was deteriorating day by day. There was no telling when he would pass away. Although there were many outstanding princes in the Shualiao tribe, the most outstanding ones were the 3rd and 13th princes. Of the two of them, one was a scholar and one was a martial artist. If these two forces could not be merged together, the decline of the Bloodstream tribe would be inevitable. But from what he knew, the relationship between the 3rd prince and the 13th prince could be said to be irreconcilable. However, if Qiu Teng chose the 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarian and gave up on the 13th prince, then what awaited him would be the fury of the Bloodspan tribe. Those tribes wouldn't care about his friendship. In the eyes of the prairie people, they had already prepared a generous gift for Qiu Teng. Qiu Teng bringing back their tribe's young men safely was his duty. Only a fool would fall out with the Bloodstream tribe in order to protect Qiu Teng. Chapter 513. Shunwu Dynasty, Imperial Capital. Lei Qiusheng paced back and forth in Yangshan Palace with his hands behind his back. He glanced around the empty palace with a gloomy face. The entire Yangshan Palace was filled with a gloomy atmosphere. Anyone who got close to the palace would find it hard to breathe. Lei Qiusheng's plan had only begun to work now. After opening up the borders, the border army under his command retreated to the Central Plains. Although they might not be able to confront the Frost Mirror cavalry head-on, they could still defend the imperial city and the nearby cities. Before the war began, Lei Qiusheng had already ensured his own safety. However, the northern frontier did not have such a good condition. The northern battlefront army was still in the north. Most of the soldiers in the Southern Battlefront Army were new recruits. Even the old soldiers were just average. They were much weaker than the elite soldiers in the Border Army. The only force that could give him pressure was the Fallen Star Army that Yang Xingqi had trained. But the number of soldiers was too small. In a large-scale battle where more than 1 million soldiers were involved, what could 5,000 soldiers do to him? Lei Qiusheng could never imagine that any army in the northern frontier could fight the Shuangjian barbarians' main force head-on. Therefore, when he knew that the Shuangjian dynasty was approaching Donglin City, Lei Qiusheng was so excited. He wanted the Shuangjian dynasty to charge in and destroy the entire northern frontier. Then, he could clean up the mess. However, the Shuangjian barbarians stop. Their main forces didn't act like before, recklessly charging into the northern territories to burn, kill, and plunder. Instead, after encountering the Southern Expedition Army that Lei Qiusheng deemed to be unable to withstand a single blow, they suddenly stopped advancing. Both sides even began to communicate. If the Shuangjian dynasty reached a peace agreement with the northern frontier, it would be a terrible nightmare for him. After all, his trump card was still in the preparation stage. If the northern frontier lost the Shuangjian dynasty's restraint, not only would they be able to quickly annex the entire northern territory, they could even deploy a series of battle plans along the river, waiting for his army to smash their heads and bleed. That's right, his head was broken and bleeding. Although he felt that the army at the northern frontier was mediocre, they were from the Shunwu dynasty and not the Qingjiang dynasty, which had the best navy in the world. Letting his meticulously trained divine martial heavy steps cross the Wei River to fight was equivalent to throwing iron cans into the Wei River. Who can tell me what the situation is in the north? Without Zhongxiu, is your embroidered guard all trash? Lei Qiusheng's gaze swept across the shadows of the Hall of Mental Cultivation as he roared angrily, "If I had known that the embroidered uniform guard was only at this level, I would have let the Servants' Administration take over the Northern Intelligence Network. Do not challenge this monarch's patience. You must send me the latest intelligence on the North within 4 hours. Furthermore, all of this monarch's orders must be completed with the highest priority." "Yes. Understood. As you command." Several feeble voices rang out from the shadows. The embroidered uniform guard's intelligence network in the north had not been disbanded, but due to Lei Qiusheng's suspicious nature, the original officers had all been purged and replaced, regardless of whether they were loyal to him or not. There was no lack of spies that he had personally placed by Zhongxiu's side. Changing generals at the last minute was a huge taboo in the army. Coupled with Lei Qiusheng's bloody purges, the entire embroidered uniform guard felt insecure. They couldn't even guarantee their own safety, so who would focus on gathering intelligence and establishing a spy network for him? Moreover, in this kind of intelligence network, there were often hundreds or thousands of spies lying dormant in a single command. Only by extending this network could a complete and mature intelligence network be formed. Zhongxiu had transferred away a group of loyal higher-ups of the embroidered uniform guard, and Lei Qiusheng had purged them himself. Currently, it was unknown how many spies were in contact with the embroidered uniform guard but didn't have official identities. After all, their command lines were already gone. Who could verify their identities? Under such circumstances, the current situation of the embroidered uniform guard wasn't as simple as just rotting away. It was even on the verge of collapse. Lei Qiusheng still had delusions that the embroidered uniform guard could maintain the powerful operational capabilities that it had when Zhongxiu was still in power. This was no different from a fool's dream. Of course, this kind of intelligence network was different from the military system. At the very least, the bloody purge of the higher-ups had shocked most people. There wouldn't be an army mutiny. As long as there was enough time, the embroidered uniform guard's original structure could definitely be restored. However, if he wanted to restore the all-pervasive scouting ability of the North, he would have to ask the Shifter Emperor Council and the embroidered uniform guard if they were willing to do so. Since you knew it would be so troublesome, why didn't you kill it back then? When I dealt with Zhongxiu, I had the opportunity to kill it. It was just a matter of convenience. A black shadow flashed, and the shadow that was supposed to be overseeing the south slowly appeared behind Lei Qiusheng. Lei Chousheng shook his head lightly and said bitterly, "The Black Jiao is indeed a difficult opponent, but it cannot die. At the very least, it cannot die now, and it cannot die at our hands." Oh! The shadow raised its eyebrows imperceptibly, as if it was curious about this statement. With the Black Jiao as the representative of the northern frontier, the Black Jiao has already set its sights on those top powers. Because of the previous incident, the Black Jiao has shown the ambition and ability to replace me. Those top powers are definitely begging for it. Otherwise, why do you think the chaos in the Shunwu dynasty has continued until now? Isn't it just those guys who are creating opportunities for the Black Jiao and stalling for time? In addition, the relationship behind the Black Jiao is also complicated. Forget about the ancient demon court, whose real identity is unknown. Anyway, it can establish a relationship with the top powers. Even if its identity is fabricated, it doesn't matter. However, its current identity is the Lord of the Northern Frontier and the Beast King of the Hungduan Mountains. It is also inextricably linked to those dragon blood demons. All the forces are trying to rope it in. If the Black Jiao dies at this time, not only will the Northern Frontier go out of control, but the Sea Demon Rebellion in the south and the Hungduan Mountains will also take revenge. Even the Frost Mirror Dynasty and the Qingjiang Dynasty will try to take a step further. Lei Chousheng put his hands behind his back, exhaled a turbid breath, and said in a cold voice, "The Black Jiao was born as a demon beast. This is its natural disadvantage. On the other hand, we are just people who killed our master and usurped the throne. We are not much stronger than it. The other 6 dynasties have been trying to find ways to balance the other forces for so many years. They will not tolerate a usurper like me to continue to exist." Got it? The shadow nodded slightly. He did not understand Lei Chousheng's thoughts, but as the shadow of Lei Chousheng, he only needed to obey the order. Chapter 514. Forget it. Let's not talk about this. A cold glint flashed across Lei Chousheng's eyes as he said, "Although the cultists' invasion into the south this time is unexpected, if we use it well, it will be of help. At least the blame won't be directly placed on us. That plan can be started. Once I have a definite order, release them immediately. The south isn't ready yet. Moreover, this is the reason why we fell out with the top powers this time. If we reveal our strength now, it'll be no different from drinking poison to quench our thirst. Although we can resolve the Frost dynasties and the North's problems, the top powers definitely won't tolerate us anymore. In fact, they might even interfere directly with this matter." The shadow took a deep breath and sighed. Moreover, the evil cult's life in the south is not good enough. They are not powerful enough. If we force them to be blamed, it will not be justifiable. There is no other way. Even if we don't want to fall out with those top forces, with their existence, we are no longer on the same side. It is only a matter of time before we fall out with them. Therefore, we don't need to hide anything from them. We just need to explain it to those who have not been in contact with this circle. It is not that I am greedy for power, but after all, the follow-up plan needs a lot of manpower and material resources to be implemented. The Shunwu dynasty can't be given up now. At least, we can't give up before we reach the first stage of the plan. Lei Chousheng shook his head gently and sighed. The Shuangjian barbarian now thinks that we are weak and can be bullied. Our previous plan not only failed to suppress the northern frontier, but also shot ourselves in the foot. Should we ask the border army to take action? The shadow looked serious. If there are too many Frost Mirror barbarian coming in this time, it will not be good for our recovery. We don't have to go all out. Ask the border army to expand the protection area. We have to protect at least half of the territory in the Central Plains. At the same time, open up a path for Frost Mirror's cavalry to go south. Although those guys are on our side, they are also hungry wolves. Without a large number of blood sacrifices to make them happy, even I can't tell what will happen. Lei Chousheng's lips curled up slightly as he sneered, "Not long after, the Shunwu dynasty will return to my rule. I can even swallow up half of the Shuangjian dynasty. After recuperating for a few years, I will turn around and swallow up the Qingjiang Empire. When that time comes, I will monopolize half of the world. Who can stop me? Yes. The shadow nodded slightly and disappeared into the shadows again. Although the scheme is good, it's a pity that there will be endless troubles in the future. Lei Chouxing put his hands behind his back and sighed. If I hadn't been prepared, the Black Jiao would have been in a general's position. Now, it's fine. The more people that come, the happier they will be. No one liked the feeling of being pressured step by step. Even Lei Chouxing, who had expected this to happen, felt the same way. How could he not know that it was not time for those things to be exposed? If he could use the Shuangjian barbarian to defeat the northern frontier, that would be the best plan. However, with the embroidered uniform guards being replaced and the ether collapsing, not only would the intelligence agencies in the north become dim, but even the intelligence agencies in the south would be dragged into the quagmire of war. In the huge Shunwu dynasty, the only thing that was under his control was the Central Plains, which was run by the Shadow. Therefore, Lin Yuan had schemed under his nose and led a large number of cultists to the south. This was something that he had not expected at all. He had been prepared to use the Shuangjian barbarian as a feint, waiting for the northern frontier to be exhausted before mobilizing the border army to take back the northern territory in one fell swoop. Because of all these arrangements, he could not sit back and watch the south collapse into the hands of the cultists. He could only cooperate with Lin Yuan's rhythm and lead the Frost Mirror Barbarian to the south, letting the barbarians fight with the interest groups in the south. In the hotbed of war, the cultists who preached that they were the representatives of the gods who saved the world would naturally find the best hotbed to grow their strength. Unless the barbarians used the power of the entire dynasty, they would not be able to eliminate the cultists with just a portion of the border army. The difference in strength between the two sides would rapidly shrink and then magnify. When the entire south fell apart, he would use the name of the cultists to release them. Then, he could send all those who held him back or did not listen to him to hell. When they were full, they would naturally be in a good mood. At that time, he would appear and communicate with them. Then, he would put on a show and drive them into the northern frontier or the territory of the Shuangjian dynasty. Not only would he be able to recover his territory, but he would also be able to completely reshuffle the cards and make the bloated dynasty his say in the future. What interest groups in the south? What northern frontier? In the eyes of Lei Chouxing, they were just a bunch of tools. Ever since he got in touch with them, his vision and structure had long surpassed his own level. Moreover, he had the special existence of the Shadow at his disposal. Naturally, he would be successful in doing things secretly. This time, the four major forces joined forces to attack the Shunwu dynasty because some disobedient fellows among them were discovered. This matter attracted the attention of the top forces, and they asked Lei Chouxing to release all the restrictions and let them search. However, Lei Chouxing, who had a guilty conscience, was naturally unwilling to agree. Therefore, the drama of the four forces attacking one was born. Although the top forces didn't have any evidence, those people knew how terrifying they were. Not to mention seeing it, even if it was just a groundless rumor, they would quickly investigate the situation. If there were any signs of something wrong, they would directly kill them. If that fellow hadn't reacted quickly and retreated with them, there would be no survivors in the entire Shunwu dynasty now. According to the original script, Lei Chouxing would be the biggest loser, and Lin Yuan, Lei Chouxing, and even the combined forces of the aristocratic families, which were not as powerful as the northern frontier, would become the winners and begin to divide this fat cake. However, among these people who had already gained benefits, except for Lin Yuan, Lei Chouxing didn't have the intention to put the others in his eyes. His real opponents had always been those high and mighty top forces. At least, this was Lei Chouxing's plan at the moment. Moreover, the development of the matter was slowly moving in the direction he had envisioned. However, no matter whether it was the reaction of Lin Yuan or the top forces, Lei Chouxing was an uncontrollable variable. Even if he was lucky enough to make use of the evil cult members introduced by Lin Yuan to talk about the matter, in an attempt to delay the time for the top forces to intervene in this matter, there were several changes in the cards in Lin Yuan's hands that he couldn't figure out in any case. You're tuning in to the Celestial War YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.